leaders in civil society, former government officials, captains of industries, who were also equally concerned about what was going on. And you will recall then it was at the tail end of the fees must fall. We had society out on the streets calling for the president to fall. Everything looked like it was about to fall. But also we were reminded that when we faced a crisis in the past, especially just before we went through our transition into the democratic dispensation, a process of scenarios was started. And that's where the Manfleur scenarios were built. And those provided our society a roadmap towards what could likely be the outcome of those 1994 elections and the trajectory of the country going forward. So we felt that, we do have that heritage of building scenarios when we are facing a moment of crisis. We went on and did the research, but as soon as we launched, that's when we attracted attention. And we do hope that with this second launch of the second Indlulamithi SA scenarios, we will attract funders, hopefully, because some of the potential funders are also in the room. We're also hoping to attract partners, because if you've heard what has been said about the scenarios, as we've already released them at the highest level last year with media, we've heard the president also making reference to them when he opened parliament. So we do hope from today onwards, we will create a movement where we start weaving ourselves towards the better future, because there are 3 different futures and none of them are easy. There's a lot of work that has to be done, but for us to head towards the most positive future, we will have to then work together and cooperate. So if we were to look at our agenda today, we've got some framing remarks that will be made by the chairperson of the Board of Trustees, with Dr. Somadoda Fikeni. But before that happens, we are in the belly of the beast. We know that we are in a building that's owned by the mining industry, and safety is of ultimate importance. So I'm going to invite a representative of Anglo American to give us a safety moment before we start with the meeting officially. Thank you.
Hey, good morning, everyone. Welcome to 144 Oxford, to Anglo American. Before I start my briefing, just to tell you, just something on a personal side, I've been with Anglo American now for 32 years. So, I mean, it's been an incredible journey. So it's a really good company, I must be honest. Before I start my briefing, just to let you know, there are no fire drills planned for the day, but just in case there is evacuation or emergency, you will be advised by the public address system of what action to take. We have got our fire ops team on site as well. It will make sure where you go and where to assemble. What you'll do if there's an emergency, or like the fire drill or the alarm goes off, you'll go through the door, down the stairs. Please hold on to that handrail for your own safety. And you'll go past the reception area and out to the front of the building. We've got assembly points A and B. You will also be told which side to go to. Please note, if you happen to be on another floor in this building, please, if you're on the stairwells, please hold on to the handrails, keep to the left, don't run and don't panic. And if you have any questions, please speak to your host or speak to our fire ops guys at the back. But as you can see, those are emergency escape routes. All right. Any questions? Everyone happy? Great. Thank you. Thank you. Enjoy. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you for that safety moment. And I just wanted to make sure that it's all systems go here. We are now just awaiting Dr. Fikeni, who's going to be giving us framing remarks. But as he's coming along from downstairs, because he's on the phone with me, I think we can actually start with at least the background to the project itself. So I'm going to ask Naeem, my colleague here, to help me to put up the slides. And as soon as Dr. Fikeni joins us, then he will make those opening remarks. Thank you so much, Naeem. I do trust that you can see the screen, and those at home or joining us on Zoom, if you can please confirm. There is someone monitoring the chat function if there's any problems there. So I had already given that snapshot to that very cold day. It was around this time of the year, actually, 7 years ago. I think it was 2017 when we started this project. And off we went to the scenarios. Now, okay, is there a clicker? Okay. So what happened when this process started? We came up with scenarios, 3 of them, which we named the Gwara Gwara scenario, Naila Walk, but also Isibujwa. These scenarios were launched by President Cyril Ramaphosa on the 21st of July, 2018, after the research process had happened. But through the barometer, we realized that actually social inequality, which is one of the 3 key drivers at that time, was the one that was pulling us to Gwara Gwara Nation, which was really a state of lawlessness. And the other 2 scenarios were really about us working together as a nation, but also what we realized, because there were so many changes happening, especially on the global sphere, it was important for us to consider refreshing these scenarios. So those who ask, why now do you have these new scenarios that you launched in 2018 and have been tracking since then until 2023? We felt that there were several developments that took place. There was obviously the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic that took place, and that actually intensified some of the key driving forces, especially the inequality. But also there were some geopolitical shifts. There's been the conflict in Ukraine, but also Palestine, where South Africa has been actually very entangled in all those very global conversations. And obviously the will impact on the future of South Africa. There's also been the rioting and looting that took place, starting in KZN and spreading to Gauteng in July 2021, which was quite a moment of rupture after those moments that we had recognized, such as Fees Must Fall and so on. And then more recently, we've had the 29th of May election that took place. So we think it is important that the scenarios are actually refreshed. The process started with us doing interviews, and we discovered several variables, a total of 26. Some of them had to do with the performance of the economy, while others were dealing with divisions in the political space. And then we had some variables, a lot of them actually dealing with issues of social cohesion. We then had variables that were dealing with issues such as governance, and we've had variables that were dealing with global politics. And as I was saying before, we're not really paying attention to these global phenomena, but the advent of COVID also made us realize that we need to pay attention to what is happening globally, because if, you know, say the East sneezes, then we catch the cold. So this time around, we had to pay special attention to global and continental factors. In addition to that, we had to look at those variables that had to do with income, poverty, and inequality, because we know that we are the most unequal country in the world. We also had issues dealing with governance, especially where provision of public services are concerned. And there's also this issue of weak leadership, especially at government level, but also institutions generally, whether in the private sector or public sector or civil society, seem to also run the risk of erosion of leadership and good governance. So we took all these variables that are just listed there, and we ranked them in terms of their uncertainty, but also in terms of their impact. On the x-axis there, you can see that we were plotting variables along the lines of their impact, because we are concerned about the future. If anything is going to happen in the future, then what is the extent of that impact? And on the y-axis, we measured uncertainty, and that's because we're working with the future and it's things that we are uncertain about. And that's when the methodology then brings in the research, or the logic rather, aspect of the intuitive logic methodology that we've adopted. So whatever variables that we do not understand but that would have high impact but also combined with high uncertainty, we would then zoom into those, and those were isolated because in the previous part, those ones were in the top right-hand quadrant. So as you can see there's about 5 variables that were isolated for further investigation, because then they informed what we call the key driving forces. Now, these key driving forces are the factors that will take us towards 2035, because in these scenarios, we are looking at where South Africa is going in 2035. So the first one is the low economic growth trap. And here we actually looking at the economic framework that we've adopted that doesn't seem to be able to generate growth, livelihoods that still remain impacted by COVID-19, especially in the creative industries. There's also, the issue of creating a conducive environment for business so that we can cultivate the expansion of new businesses, especially in the informal sector. Also, technologies and innovations that present many opportunities but are still not maximized because there's still inequality in terms of the way in which we have access to technology, but also how South Africa's economic fortunes will always be impacted on by global factors. So whatever happens geopolitically will impact on our economy, and that's what we found. So that's the first key driving force. The second key driving force has to do with state weakness and declining accountability. Here, we're looking at how the state continues to face weak leadership. And then that impacts on the provision of services, and we know that our infrastructure continues to disintegrate because of the lack of maintenance. Institutions and procedures remain largely valued by South Africa. However, because there's this weak leadership, those are also threatened, even though we still find that South Africans still have faith in and value the institutions, especially the Chapter 9 institutions. There's also declining accountability and social responsibility, especially in the private sector, wherein we see business, big business in particular, folding their arms and waiting for certainty from a state that is not capable. Whereas we also expect business to also have a level of social responsibility. There's also a culture of corruption and unaccountability. And these are all the issues that impact on the weaknesses of the state and declining accountability, but also added to that, there's this idea of our politics that are still driven by party politics. We find that South Africans are unable to politic outside the party political system. The last variable, or a key driving force rather, is that of internal security threats. And these are influenced by anger and distrust, but also factors such as resistance to renewal. So we find that in our society, we're still finding it so difficult to find each other as a society. And the anger that is actually, especially felt by young people who experience high unemployment and as a result are dislocated. And so there's this youth alienation in our country. There's anger and distrust that manifests in a violent society, whether it's violent protest, violent crime, but we also have contestation around identity politics, and those tend to also be quite violent. There's historical trauma that continues into the present. So the intergenerational woundedness, it still impacts on the level of social cohesion, or to the extent to which we can experience social cohesion. There's also an absence of spaces for us as a society to build cohesion. So as long as there's very few spaces where we can find cohesion, except for when maybe the Springboks or, the Bafana Bafana or now the Olympics, then we find a moment of social cohesion, but there's very few spaces beyond that. Although civil society and media still continue to hold the state accountable, but without meaningful inclusion of young people and the lack of youthful voices, there's still an increasing risk of citizens becoming very passive. The intra-regional migration that remains uncontrolled is also very contentious. We do know that there's currently a debate that's going on. It's on a very public domain, and it is around this issue of migration. And then you add to that toxic mix, the lack of progress on land reform. So these key driving forces are the ones that are going to be taking us forward to either of the three scenarios that we are unveiling today. I'm going to then invite my colleague, Naim Jenna, to actually take us through the scenarios.
Yes, but oops. Okay, all this effort is just to get you to listen to these sounds of the birds, and they are being very. Here we go. Thank you, Kolelwa. I look around the room and I see some people who attended the launch of the scenarios in November last year. And some people who've been through like a dozen different versions of this. Annette, who the first very rough version was presented, and all subsequent versions thereafter. And I pointed to Annette in particular, partly because she sat through all of those, but also Annette was with the Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation. And these Indlulamithi 2035 scenarios were used by the department in the drafting of the medium-term development plan. Just to make the point that scenarios are not just nice pictures and don't just provide material for the president in his parliamentary speech, but they actually can be quite useful. So in the development of the medium-term development plan, every priority that was considered partly through the window of these scenarios and how they would impact on each other. So that's just to say that. And then, of course, the special thing about today as compared to last year is that we're now launching the full text. So you will hear the very summarized version of the presentation, but we have now available the full text of the scenarios. And how many pages is it? Close to 130 pages of these scenarios, the background that Kolelwa presented and the scenarios. So I want us to consider ourselves as being not here in not July, it's August 2024, but we are sitting at Anglo-American or wherever else, but on the 25th of December, 2035. That's our dateline. That's where we are. And we sitting and reflecting on what it looks like, what South Africa looks like now on the 25th of December, 2035, and how we got here. So before we get into the three scenarios, let's just say that we think that what you're going to see on this slide is what will occur in any of these three scenarios. This is what the world will look like in any of the three scenarios that we will present. So, for example, the impact of climate change is very severe. 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels has been passed already. Food security is a problem globally. Pandemics have become more regular and more deadly. Antimicrobial resistance has increased, making diseases even more prevalent. Lots of technological advancements, but uneven benefits from those. Those who are more well off in whatever kind of way benefit more, and those who are less benefit less. In terms of geopolitics, there's been a global kind of shift eastwards. both in terms of political power as well as economic power. And so this is the kind of global scenario within which our 2035 Indlulamithi scenarios is located. We assume that this is how it will be, as I say, in all of the scenarios. So what does South Africa look like in some of the constants, in a sense, certainties at that time? Our population has increased steadily. We're now sitting at 70 million at the beginning of this year. 37 million of that, so more than half of those people, are what we today call born frees. About a quarter of our population lives in rural areas, compared to in 1990, it was half. So there's been quite a bit of movement to urban areas. 2/3 of the population is concentrated in 3 provinces: Gauteng, Western Cape, and KwaZulu-Natal. So that's what it looks like today. 25th December 2035. Now we're going to go into the 3 scenarios that we've come up with for what South Africa will look like in this year. So the first scenario, yes, one of my favorite birds, the Hadeda. The first scenario is called Hadeda Home, the Recrimination Nation. We all know the Hadedas, and for those who don't know, these are not indigenous to the Haifas. They're not indigenous to Gauteng. They're actually coastal birds that have, for various reasons, mostly to do with humans, have relocated to this part of the country. But this scenario, we talk about the recrimination nation. Everyone blames everyone else. Things don't go well, but there's always someone to blame for why things are not going well. Social trust by now has broken down. South Africans have retreated, creating their own kind of lagers based on whatever, based on wealth, based on ethnicity, based on linguistic group, whatever you like to look at. But there's ways in which we can form lagers for ourselves. The enclaves are created, and groups protect themselves within their own enclaves in whatever way they might be able to. Those who can afford to have their own security companies, etc. Those who can't have their own, I don't know, self-defense units. Generally, like the Hadedas, people are skittish. Everyone's on edge and blaming everyone else for what's happening. The economy is there is an economy. It's sputtering along. Mining has become more mechanized. Agriculture is struggling against climate change. Manufacturing growth has largely stalled. We have had a transition to renewable energy, but an unjust one. And that's why it is under severe criticism from various sectors. Clean water is scarce, acid rain, power outages, wild weather, etc. that affect us across the country. Women continue to bear the brunt of poverty and violence, and crime rates remain high in general, but particularly against women. Unemployment in this scenario is at 37%. Youth unemployment is at 50%. Okay, so in terms of power and governance, this is what we look like. In all 3 of our scenarios, by 2035, we say that we'll have coalition governments, certainly at the national level, but most of the other spheres as well. And so, we've had a democracy now for just over 40 years, moderated by kind of political contestation, but political parties are no longer trusted by the electorate, by the population as a whole. More than 70% of our people don't trust political parties. More than half the population doesn't trust the judiciary anymore either. I didn't do anything. It's automatic. It detects the sound of my voice and then adjusts it. It actually detects the temperature in the room. So we have a centrist social democratic coalition at national level, whatever that might mean. I mean, by now, these things don't mean too much. But even though it's a coalition, or perhaps because it's a coalition government, party leaders control all the processes, everything takes long for decisions to be made, because everything has to be negotiated, etc. And so from the population as a whole, people just want things to happen. People want things to speed up, things to be delivered. And in fact, a large proportion of our population has says repeatedly in polls that they would be happy not to have elections and not to have a democracy if there was service delivery. That is the more important issue. That is the thing that they're being deprived of, and the cause of their marginalization. It's not the elections that's the issue. So, at a global level, I gave a kind of broad overview earlier on. The China-US rivalry has by now escalated beyond just intense economic competition. And we're now finding hot flashpoints in the Pacific and other areas as well. The African Union is faction-driven, is weak, unable to prevent the frequent coups that had stopped for a while and then restarted just over a decade ago. China, our big trading partner for many years, has seen the way South Africa is going, undercut South Africa's standing with our neighbors, through skillful way in which it deployed its Belt and Road Initiative, from which we don't benefit, but also creates ways in which we become more marginalized as South Africans. Our so-called, the new term now, in this decade, rhetorical ambivalence has cost us in terms of our economy and our political standing globally. Over time, our various benefits such as AGOA have been restricted, our relationships with the EU have been strained, and many of the benefits that we previously had, we're not getting anymore. And so we tried to do something of a balancing act and lost out on all sides. So we have then, in summary, gained very little from this west to east power shift, political and economic. And this despite the fact that South Africa has long, from 1994 for the past 40 years, has been championing the notion of a multilateral order, where power is spread among different poles, multipolar world, etc. After all of that, when we finally close to that happening, we see no benefit out of it for ourselves and for our people. Climate change, of course, is a big issue. Higher temperatures, erratic rainfall, soil productivity has been affected, resulting in poor crop yields, water shortages, freakish weather in different parts of the country, flash floods, droughts, all of those kinds of things that we are beginning to see already. So it's not, suddenly happening in 2035. We saw it happening from 15 years ago, at least. Climate change impacts the cost of food. South Africa regularly now imports about 75% of its wheat, for example. The economic impact of climate change is huge as well. We've lost opportunities of the Just Energy Transition Investment Plan because of bad management, etc. Thousands of workers have lost their jobs with the closure of 8 of the 14 power stations. The details of all of this, of course, is in the long text. We even talk about which power stations, etc. Large farms have been, in a sense, buffered against climate change to some extent. And so we're seeing fruit, sugar production increasing, for example. And there's been a little increase in agricultural jobs as a result. So our agricultural sector hasn't done too badly compared to the other sectors in our economy. Okay, I'm very sorry for this extremely busy slide. But our economy by now, in the mid-2030s, has suffered from deep structural constraints. Slow economic growth persists. After 20 years, Eskom has finally been rescued from the criminals that had captured it, but by many of them being bought off and given shares and some kind of role. So I'm not sure that it's completely rescued. Private entities and municipalities have been very active in sourcing their own power. 40% of municipalities, for example, at least partly self-sufficient in terms of power. Eskom's transmission and distribution units are no longer losing money. Private green energy generation uses its core infrastructure effectively. So we're finding that Eskom's supply is fairly stable, sufficient now because the demand is so much less, and the energy is cleaner. Transnet has been recapitalized twice through BRICS loans and some assistance from India, which we will have to pay for at some stage. SAA has been fully privatized. We've added only 3 million new jobs since COVID 15 years ago, despite our 3 million full-time jobs, despite our population now being 70 million. 50% of our working age population, which is 44 million, is not in employment, education, or training. Unemployment rate 37, youth unemployment 55. The middle class has shrunk, tax base continues shrinking, government borrows heavily from the IMF and also the BRICS National Development Bank. The national debt is now at 12 trillion rands, regarded as kind of manageable. Our debt repayments are more than 2 billion rands per day. Passive grey listing and further downgrades. One of the positive things is that young people have kind of, they're not idle. They're not sitting and waiting for government to give them jobs and to give them whatever else government can. They're doing their own things. A lot of it is good things. And a lot of it has to do with new technologies that they leverage in ways that they can. Also finding their own ways and reasons to get more involved in communities and try to uplift their own communities. Commercial farms have, as I said, been buffered from climate change, and so we're finding fruit, sugar, vegetable production grown steadily. Manufacturing and mining has stabilized. Stabilized doesn't mean it's improving. Stabilized, it's no longer shrinking as a share of the GDP. Our huge PGM reserves and deposits of other precious and critical metals are still underexploited because of policy uncertainty by investors and the high cost of crime mitigation now. The mining sector is still important, provides 500,000 jobs, but from the past 30 years or so, the mining sector has been shrinking by about 1% annually, which, if you compare to our competitors, theirs has been increasing by around 4% annually. And so we're finding that other African countries have surpassed us in terms of mining, exploration, expenditure, and investment. Okay. So a kind of quick summary of this. In the Hadeda home scenario, apartheid special planning endures. We have all of these kind of lagers and enclaves. The middle class is slowly mixing, but it doesn't have broader impact. There are a few places to build social cohesion or a sense of nationhood. There's gatekeepers, rent takers, petty power officials, all over the place, trying to line their pockets, and they all blamed for the bad situation we're in, often correctly so. There's been half-hearted reforms, poor implementation that hasn't taken us anywhere, and the buck seems to stop nowhere. No one takes responsibility. Everyone blames everyone else, and of course, always the easiest people to blame are those who are most vulnerable: foreigners, women, lack of family, all of those kinds of things. History, Jan van Riebeeck, still, good to blame. So there's hope. Maybe the youth will change things. We're not a basket case yet. Maybe the youth that are getting more and more active will change things. Maybe AI and hydrogen and all of that will make a difference, but we're not sure whether a new sense of hope is justified. And so that takes us to our second scenario, and this one we're calling vulture culture. Our president used it as an insult in his replies to questions in Parliament. Not sure that the vultures will be very happy to be compared to politicians, but nevertheless. So in this scenario, South Africans are now more united than they've ever been against the government. We have authoritarian populist coalitions that rule the scene at in all spheres of government. Growth has stalled, and in fact, since 2029, the economy has shrunk. Fiscal catastrophe is imminent. If you thought that the last scenario was bad, more than half of adults are jobless. 1/3 of South Africans go to bed hungry at least once a week. Organized crime has seized the initiative from a disorganized and corrupt state. And we even find that we have no-go areas where the state has no role because organized criminals have taken over ruling or governing essentially those places. Desperate South Africans have started for the past half a decade at least leaving the country and going to particularly other African countries, but also elsewhere where things look and are better. There's been huge gas and oil deposits on the West Coast. We're not sure whether that will change things, certainly not for the better. We don't know. So how did we get here to this point? From 2024, so remember that these scenarios were drafted towards the end of last year, finalized towards the end of last year. In the 2024 election, we have a liberal right-of-center coalition that started governing South Africa until 2029. I can see some people in the audience will suggest that that is what we have, but I'm not going to get into those political debates. And two of the big things for this government was one, austerity, and two, fighting crime, both of which landed it in trouble because the results were widespread kind of rebellion against these. Austerity meant that service delivery was reduced, and fighting crime was a heavy-handed approach that didn't help, and people had a problem with. And despite this, the heavy-handed anti-crime measures, well, backfired. And when they backfired, the big criminals, crime bosses, consolidated their power. Populist parties that have been part kind of hangers-on on this liberal coalition, by the end of the 2020s, left the coalition because they saw the opportunity, and they began to exploit the desperation in the economy and in the population, high inflation, etc. In the provinces, we saw by the late 2020s a return to ethnic movements, urging a return to what they call traditional values, whatever that might mean. They hold the balance of power in 4 provincial governments now, 3 of the large metros. And the struggle for power and access to resources trumps any idea of governance and of serving the people of South Africa. So in 2029, we had an inconclusive election. As a result, after lots of horse trading, a populist coalition then took power. It was a bit shaky, but nevertheless took power. From the very beginning, proved itself to be policy poor and power hungry. Funneling resources to its constituencies to ensure that it won the next election in 2034 last year. There were defections to this populist coalition from those who saw the opportunities, including from, you might remember, the ANC ruling coalition, ruling party until 2024, including from them. When the gas and oil was discovered, this meant cash that can be disbursed to win more support by the coalition. It was very skillful in dishing out tenders, food parcels, etc., vilifying business, pinning crimes on foreigners, all of the good populist things that gains such parties' support. In terms of the global scene, the West, so-called, still remains vital to South Africa's economy, But as I said, global power has shifted eastwards. Increased protectionism and tariff wars have broken out globally as nations seek to regrow their local economies. China remains South Africa's largest trading partner, but the power imbalance is huge, and our debt burden grows. South Africans struggle with the reality that by the beginning of this decade, by around 2030, we were a minor player in BRICS, which is now BRICS Plus, which is now about 24 states that are members, but we no longer have any weight to push around or to punch above. Our relations with the AU are frosty, particularly after last year's election, when many AU member states accused us of not having a free and fair election. And Africa has finally gained a seat in the UN Security Council, but we're not in the running for it. Climate change, average temperatures have risen, affected us quite seriously. Ice caps melt, bushfires, air pollution, droughts, unseasonable rainfall, etc. The issue for us is that there's not been investment in infrastructure. There's not been the kind of maintenance that is required, and we're not in a position to be able to mitigate the effects of climate change, and we are seriously suffering as a result. The economy, so we had lots of good policies and laws post-94, right up to the mid-2020s. Employment equity laws, water laws, NHI, mining charters, all of these kinds of laws and policies. But all of these laws and policies meant to do good and create a better society can also be weaponized for the opposite. That is weaponized in order to serve a particular elite. And that's what has happened now. And so it's become, the implementation has become self-serving for particularly the political elite that also wants to become the economic or financial elite. Our budget deficits have widened dramatically since the late 2020s. Mineral extraction levels are lower than they were in 1995. Rating agencies have downgraded us further. By not investing in South Africa, ironically, global capital has helped an investment-unfriendly government to emerge in 2029. The authoritarian coalitions of 2029 and 2034 have thumbed their noses at so-called Western capitalist logics. China and Saudi Arabia, though, are quite happy to keep lending to us, thank God. But their loans are collateralized by our mineral wealth and recent gas and oil discoveries, and crucially, by our land. Unemployment is deeply entrenched, systemic, and highly racialized. So, to be crude, more Black people are unemployed than white people. Unemployment, as it has always been, I should just say, but it's worse now. Narrowly defined, our unemployment is 44%. Youth unemployment, 63%. Half of unemployed South Africans have never had a formal job. 70% of unemployed youth under 35 have had, at best, this nice term that we use, work opportunities. The only major employment growth over the past decade has been in government. So government has become quite bloated. When you add municipalities, universities, etc., all kind of employed by the state in some or other way, more than 2.5 million employees are dependent on the public purse, and they earn 40% of all wages paid across South Africa. Trade union membership falls steeply as union leaders become co-opted and see the opportunities in this. As a result, they sell out the workers and the working class. Their collusion with employers and with government means that bodies like CCMA and NEDLAC become quite useless and don't serve any purpose whatsoever. Again, nice ideas, but right now, don't do anything. Okay, heavy government borrowing, National Youth Service funded by borrowed money, shortage of basic foods, hunger and malnutrition increase, CPI increases regularly. By this year, South Africans are effectively 25% poorer than we were 15 years ago in 2020. Remember, 2020 is COVID. Huh? Okay, the NHI is a mirage. It's there, but it serves those who, well, not everyone. More than 200 billion is needed just to maintain the health infrastructure by 2020. Sorry. New HIV medications are available globally, but we can't afford it. South Africans' average life expectancy has stalled, and our life expectancy is now lower than that of Senegal. Just a random African country, nothing special about Senegal. Okay, crime is the big industry in South Africa now. It's evolved from being kind of disorganized and contingent to now being systemic and well-structured. And the state weakness helps that. Construction mafias, water mafias, etc. Kidnappings for ransom has increased dramatically. The judicial system can't cope. Well, those parts of the judicial system that are not bought. So, for example, 94% of murders result in no convictions this year. 98% of armed robberies and hijacking, same thing. Only 3% of reported rape cases result in jail sentences, last year's statistics. The vultures in our society feel that they are able to act with impunity. For the first time, our daily homicide number has exceeded 100 beginning of this year. Okay, so quick summary. This populist coalition that now rules after last year's election, where they entrenched themselves, closed down the democratic space. South Africans, for example, are reeling after the 2 years ago, 2033, Foreign Interference Act, which shut down many prominent NGOs, prevented so-called foreign funding of the media. The SABC has been fully taken over and has now become not only not the national broadcaster, not even the state broadcaster, but the broadcast of a particular kind of political elite. SOE boards are stacked with the ruling coalition's allies, and South Africans have been leaving in droves. African professionals from other African countries who have come here to work have also left. It's frankly safer, and they earn better elsewhere, even in their own countries. Also, of course, xenophobia has gone up with the kind of populism that we live with. For ordinary South Africans, life is hard in the vulture culture nation. Because with all our resources, the vultures get there first. Our president's favorite bird, the weaver. So a word about the weaver. I'm sure many of us have seen weavers in our gardens or in our parks. The Cape weaver, right? The Cape, you know the Cape weaver, right? The poor man who builds the nest and then flutters his wings, and the woman comes, checks it out. If she doesn't like it, she flies away, and then he takes the whole nest apart and then rebuilds it. Poor guy. Okay, that's not the one we're talking about. The weaver that we're talking about is the Kalahari sociable weaver. The Kalahari sociable weaver is different. The Kalahari sociable weaver, you have a whole lot of birds that construct one nest. And let me find a picture of, where's a picture? There. That's one nest constructed by a number of birds together. And then they live there as families. There are nests that have housed up to 100 families, sociable weaver families. There's also a record of one nest lasting 199 years, which means it's also multi-generational. Okay, so this is a very interesting bird. Those who drive through the Karoo, you'll see these nests on whatever trees are left, but also on light poles. right? And so this is the bird that we are talking about, the weaver nation that we're talking about, the cooperation nation. So what we found in this scenario is that by the mid-2020s, after the 2024 election, things have not improved in South Africa. No, things did not improve in South Africa. We found by around 2026 that growth rate had been improving. 2026, 2027, we looked at a growth rate of more than 4%, compared to 10 years ago, when the growth rate was 11 years ago, 2 years before that, when the growth rate was less than 1%. Within 2 years, that increased as a result of structural reforms, etc. The problem is that it served only certain elites. Unemployment didn't improve that much, etc. And by around 2026, 2027, people were khatfol. And so we talk here in this scenario about the khatfol nation. People were khatfol and decided that they needed to do something about it. Starts off with small protests here and there, but expands into a national kind of movement of rolling mass action. All of those from the 1980s, those terms. Rolling mass action that sees not only communities and social movements, but religious groups getting involved and interfaith movement being created. Artists kind of jump on the bandwagon, dance onto the bandwagon, perhaps, and give inspiration to this kind of protest movement, which by the late 2020s, before the 2029 election, some of the politicians sit up and take notice. And so 2029 election is won by a coalition that whose main platform is that it calls itself the Listening Coalition, that it will listen to what people have to say, and it wins the election, a coalition, not a party, not with a huge margin, but it wins. Immediately, as a result of the kind of lessons of the late 2020s, it puts into place new structures that seek to develop, a weaver nation, where there's cooperation between different sectors. And so you find at various different levels for various different things, these kind of structures set up that include representatives of the state, of business, of civil society, of communities, that try and address the needs, so that there isn't a return to that protest movement of the mid to late 2020s. Last year's election was particularly fiercely contested, and the bigger parties in the 2029 coalition kind of asserted themselves, and they won last year's election, 2034, even more decisively. That last point should be carefully managed, not carefully manged. Green transition. Okay, so I've summarized all of this because I'm running out of time. And after the 2029 election, things began improving. After just before last year's election, these parties formed what they called the Concord Coalition, with an agreement that they called the Concord Agreement. As a result of this and the assertiveness of this and the partnerships created and cooperation, governance has been improving, and the government has been able to convince the world, in a sense, that we are here, that we are open for business, and that we can assert ourselves not only in South Africa but on the global scene. So on the global scene, then, we've managed, certainly in the past 6-7 years, 6 years, certainly since 2029, we've managed better to balance our diplomatic non-alignment and our economic interests. Not playing one party off against another, but realizing that we can benefit from various different sections and maintain our independence at the same time. Our role in BRICS Plus was leveraged to strengthen regional pacts, including the African continental free trade area, with many benefits for South Africa as a result. BRICS Plus members have been pushed to reform global institutions, despite some kicking and screaming from some of them, like the ones that are non-elected on the Security Council, but nevertheless, they were forced into it. And they supported that, and the UN Security Council has now been reformed. South Africa is in the running for the African seat. We also regard it as one of the kind of entry points into the rest of the continent for investment. This in a context where in North America, in Europe, we've been seeing lots of internal political battles and as a result, parochialism. The shift to the right wing has redefined what these governments are, and even redefined the sense of nationhood for many of these countries, which has created a kind of a power vacuum, not a vacuum, but opportunities for countries of the global south, such as South Africa, to step into. Apart from BRICS, there's also IORA, the Indian Ocean Rim Association, which in the past 5-6 years, South Africa has been championing more and getting benefits out of that. Also deeper ties with the ASEAN countries and other regional blocs. Global temperatures have exceeded the Paris cap. In South Africa, higher temperatures, erratic rainfall, etc., all the things I spoke about already. But South Africa has spearheaded African Union food security plans that have ensured that there's been discussion among African states about agriculture, about where to grow what and who, etc., that has created a kind of partnership and cooperation across the continent to ensure food security. So, for example, at the beginning of the 20th century, 60% of agricultural land was lying fallow. Now that's around 40%. There's increased use of agricultural land. There's also implementation of more sustainable water use. And government has supported ventures by universities and agricultural research institutes to develop new strains of maize and wheat to withstand the harsher climates. So in all of this, you're seeing this kind of cooperation coming through. Eskom, with the help of the private sector, of course, Eskom, Transnet's freefall has been arrested, etc. Eskom was able to close some of its coal stations last year ahead of schedule. Another one is scheduled to close next year. Steep drops in crime since 2030 have also boosted tourism, and related industries have ramped up direct contribution to GDP to 5%, to 4.5%, adding more jobs, etc. Immigration to South Africa has increased as well, bringing with it skills. FDI has continued to steadily increase from around 2030, 2031. Better access to internet, all of that. Important here is the creative sector, which kind of came more into its own in the late 2020s. And this included art tourism, which helped to stimulate economic activity and growth, and increased its share in the GDP. Urbanization and rural-urban migration have slowed due to increased investment in the agricultural and tourist sectors in rural areas. Okay, so summary here. In 2029, Parliament revived the National Youth Service, kind of jumping on that volunteerism bandwagon of the late 2020s, seeing that you know, this growing kind of desire, even need of particularly young people to be involved in their communities, whether it was through protesting for the good of their communities or doing other things. Passed the Youth National Service Act in 2031, through which youth were placed in active service teams with people from different backgrounds. So there was a deliberate attempt to mix rural and urban, different so-called racial groups, class, etc. This partnered with the financial institutions, national retailers, etc., meant that there were also job opportunities for these young people after that. Right, so this is the summary, sorry. So the Concord Coalition bolstered, no, this is not the summary. Yes, it is. The Concord Coalition bolstered the investigative and intelligence gathering capacity of its various crime-fighting institutions. Special courts for financial crimes were established. So after the 7 lean economic years, to get biblical about it, up to 2028, South Africa has enjoyed 7 fat years from 2028 until this year, with increased growth, recovery, increased employment, reducing its inequality. Getting here required cooperation between strong, what had become by the late 2020s, strong, assertive civil society, a more active citizenry, and a political elite that was willing to find common ground, including with its critics. The local elections loom next year, and many hope that that will help then to transform local service delivery in which, and similar to how the past half a decade has transformed it at a national and provincial level. With more cooperative leaders, compromise, long-term thinking, South Africans seem determined now to make the country and the nation work. So, after half a decade of collaborative government at national, provincial, and local levels, and industrious weaver work by numerous unsung grassroots heroes, many South Africans now believe that next year, 2036, might be South Africa's best year ever.
Thank you so much, Naeem, for taking us to the future, to actually imagine ourselves in 2035. We know it's not too far and it's not too difficult to imagine because some of the issues seem to have happened. But thank you for that storytelling, wonderful storytelling, Naeem. Naeem is the senior researcher at the Mapungupo Institute for Strategic Reflection, MISTRA, which is a strategic partner of Indlulamithi that leads the actual research of the scenarios. So thank you so much, Naeem, for that. We've had to rearrange our program a bit, but I think it actually worked out perfectly because as we now have heard the scenario, at least the high-level scenario, you can maybe take a moment to look at your program, those who are in the room. If you flip it, at the back end, there's a QR code there. And I think the colleagues on the technical side will also upload it on the Zoom platform. If you go to the QR code and you scan it, that's where you find the book. So we're trying to move with the times and also to not kill as many trees as we would have in the past. But those who are interested, especially those who have attended today physically, we will actually ensure that they receive a nice physical copy of it, but you can download it now. You can alert us if the QR code is not working. There's also posters around the room where you can find the QR code and you've got the full book with the full text of the scenarios. So thank you to the MISTRA team for leading that research. Now we're going to finally hear from our chairperson, Dr. Somadoda Fikeni, that you all know is an analyst, but he's also the commissioner at the Public Service Commission. And he's going to help us to try and figure out what to do with these scenarios. Welcome, Prof.
Thank you very much, Polelwa. Polelwa has become synonymous with scenarios. In fact, we're starting to say she's Miss Indlulamithi. And first, I would like to greet this distinguished audience, my fellow Board of Trustees members. I see them there, Cass. I see Bishop, and I see my Oh, I see even Uzukiswa, and I see my sister here, whom you know in the radio services every weekend. But if I miss out on any other members of our Board of Trustees, I acknowledge you even in the virtual platform. Our partners who are in attendance today, and I hope, Michelle, you'll play this in your radio programs and so forth and just popularize it as one of the novels during your radio shows. I am going to take you back from what has been, oh, how can I forget our host, who is going to give a keynote address. And so I want to unveil her now, and also our trust administrator, Advocate Mapongwana. The first thing is to take you back from 2035, which was quite an exciting journey. There once was a movie which said Back to the Future, when in fact very often I have a sense that we say forward to the past. So I'm going to take you back from 2035 back to 2024, the most boring period, where we say, what does this all mean? Very briefly, we had a moment of pride after 8 years of work on the scenarios. When we even went to address businesses crisscrossing the country, civil society, different role players. One forum that we attended with Abba, I think Polelo, you were there with Andile Sanu. They asked us a question. I think it was Distel and Remgro in the Western Cape. We hear your story about the future and the scenarios, but is the presidency listening? Is the government internalizing what you are saying? I can't remember what our answer was, but I think we were speaking in tongues at that particular moment. Now you can imagine, after all those years, when I was seated in Parliament and the president went on for a good 5 minutes reflecting on these scenarios in a policy platform where everybody was seated at home in the evening to hear what the government of national unity and what society was going to do. For all these years, we seem not to have had as much traction. But all of a sudden, there was this extensive reflection and a call to the nation to be that cooperation weaver-bird nation. Not only that, as part of Indlulamithi, we started some work on consensus building national dialogues, which lead to a social compact or a blueprint for the future. We worked with GIBS, a business school of the University of Pretoria scholars. We had an international conference to say, what have other countries done when they face challenges? What's the nature of dialogue? What's the nature of social compacts? Which ones have failed and why? And which ones have succeeded? So that work, as we move towards national dialogue, we spent a good 3 years doing that work. So, which means this initiative, which started a few years ago, 8 years to be precise, is beginning to gain traction. And is beginning to weave itself into the national imagination. And that is the reason why we appreciate your presence here to say, this is not an academic exercise. When we give you these scenarios, it's not rolling on the wheels of inevitability to say you'll end up in this scenario or that scenario. It simply says, should you take action, we may end up in this scenario. Should you not take action and just allow things as they are, we may end up in that particular scenario. We are in a situation as a country at a crossroads where even if we choose not to choose, that's still a choice. By choosing not to choose or choosing not to be active, you have made a definitive choice, and you'll have to embrace the results of your choicelessness. Another moment of pride was not so long ago when we're presenting into one of the businesses, when the doyen of scenarios, Sam Clanton, Clem Santa, sorry, endorsed our project and even said, can we use the work of this Indlulamithi as we travel around the world and make reference to it? You can imagine this is a person used across the world. He has written so many books. He is the authority on scenarios. And finally, this work is now gaining traction in that space as well. Yesterday afternoon, as I was presenting in Gaborone, Botswana, in the International Ombuds Association, people from the Commonwealth came and said, we would like to talk about these Indlulamithi scenarios, which means it's beginning to make waves. And one member from SADC said, we would like to talk about this work you are doing on the scenarios. 8 years later. Of course, one of the things when we started the scenarios was to look at how other predecessor scenarios had functioned, what their strengths, what their weaknesses were. And we embraced and invited some of the people who had been part of those previous scenarios. Kusam, Mampele Rampele, and several other scholars, because we said, tell us about why some of the scenarios seem to have not gained traction, or some of the well-crafted scenarios simply came at the wrong time. Maybe we're also lucky that we come at a time when there are so many crises that we face. The other point I want to say before I say this is a call to action is to say that in our initial report 2018, which was launched by President Cyril Ramaphosa, we had projected that if we're drifting in the Gwara direction, we would end up with ANC losing its majority, and that we would have coalitions. We even said the country needs to start preparing, regulating the space for coalitions. But at that time, when future is approaching you, it looks so far until it is so near and until it is recent. And that is where we are. By the time we were called into this coalition dialogue, it was only a few weeks before elections. Of course, it's not the best time for doing that work because everyone is edgy. Any language, any diction is interpreted for what are you trying to do to gain advantage or to leave other people out. So we're in this VUCA moment, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, which is not a passing phase, which means scenario work will actually become more and more important. This is what Professor Pityana cited, a Canadian scholar, Henry Jerox, at the height of our crisis, where he depicted South Africa as having become an exercise of disimagination. A society without capacity for imagination will forever live in the present, even when foundation has become eroded by centrifugal forces, while denying their existence. He further suggests that there is hardly any feature of society that has not been crippled by such a criminal thoughtlessness. Indeed, when you come to think of it, turning to colleagues in the media and colleagues in scholarship, much of almost 90% of our energies, we put them into headlines, sensation, daily happenings. Today, we focus on a person who had some interaction with a goat like Mamboy, and that becomes a headline. Tomorrow, we have this obsession for almost a week about who is going to be Miss South Africa. And I say, as if we do not have enough problems. You turn into this radio station. And when I was leaving Gaborone Airport and I tuned, because I normally tune to their local radio station, they were talking developmental issues. Where will we be in 5 years, in 10 years? You read a newspaper in Ethiopia, they talk about this, grand Renaissance Dam. What will it do for us? You come to South Africa, a noisy, argumentative, headline-obsessed, temperamental democracy that is fascinated with sensation. Because future means nothing to us. The strategic thinking about future, what is this meaning? And if it continues, what will be the trend? We exercise our energies on the here and now. And you'd think that there is no tomorrow. You'd think that we do not have other problems. When I left, we were talking about this Miss South Africa. I come back, we're talking about this Miss South Africa. There is an industry of drugs, 2 billion found in a farm. We've even forgotten that it happened. There are 95 Libyans which were found in a farm somewhere. We say, that was for 2 days. We're moving on. We want to talk about this Miss South Africa. It tells you when they say it's a society of disimagination. So, we are inviting you to look at these scenarios and popularizing them. We do have a barometer to track which differentiates us from other scenarios. Where are we drifting? From now onwards, are we moving towards the vulture culture? Are we moving towards a weaver bird, cooperation nation? Or are we a Hadida recrimination nation? So we're inviting you to utilize this, popularize this, whether in the private sector, in civil society, or in business. We really would like to acknowledge our business partners, like Anglo-American and many others, that they tolerated us when we said, we would like you to give us money, but don't tell us what we're going to do in terms of thinking. Because at times we may even turn against you if the research tells us, but they've tolerated us. And that in itself we really appreciate. As we go to the national dialogue in your spaces, mainstream this work. And when we have the doyens of the media here, make sure that this becomes the mainstream thing and just invite the country to dream about the future again. And know that whatever happens today is not your destination. Our preoccupation should be about what role should each one of us play, utilizing tools such as these ones. Will even make the work that we did on social compacts and national dialogues available. Make us trend in the social media. Make everybody at home forget about some of these daily happenings. Because when we say school children in a tragic situation were killed, we go on to say, oh my God, here it has happened again. We never step back to say, why do we have these things recurring? What should be fixed? Rather, we wait so that even a criminal who has swindled billions, they say, no, if you are in South Africa, just clench your teeth for 1 week, because their mind next week will move on to the next development. That's why we have no sustainability in our focus to the future, because we have become more like the mentality of a social media. The trending topics change every 4 hours, they change every day, but there is no strategic reflection on the trends going into the future. That's why our negative energies are on the high. That's why cynicism about the future is on the high. That's why a sense of despair is on the high. You go to countries like Lebanon at war, but how hopeful they are, how willing they are to think about possibilities of future. And you come to a country like ours with such a great potential. Everybody envies this country except its own citizens because of the negative energies. Now, before I make you more and more uncomfortable, I just want to say, we invite you to this journey to the future. And we also want to remind you, as my last point, that each time this country has gone through difficulties, we've gone through so many. South Africa is a very complex society, and it has gone through so many challenges. In the 50s, imagine, we were only a few years away. The whole world had dismissed fascism, Nazism, Mussolini in Italy, and so forth. And they said there was a new era, only to find that 3 years after the war, South Africa was going directly in that way, apartheid. So by the 50s, there was a sense of despair. Liberation movement has become moribund. Then the Youth League said, no, let's have a program of action. In the 1950s, the Congress of the People mobilized everybody from society, from the priests, sports people, teachers, professionals, and they crafted this document called Freedom Charter. Whether you agree with it or not, it has found expression in the Constitution and so forth, because it was a product of the people. In the 80s, again, when P.W. Botha was stubborn, was everything, there was state of emergency, there was everything, and people were predicting we're going into a racial civil war. People from all over business, trade unions, political formations, cultural groups, poets, they gathered again to craft a new future for the country. And again, during the World Cup, when every society knew we had this one goal and everybody was mobilized from the informal sector, person roasting maize next to the road, knowing what is at stake, up to government, we became a winning nation. What does that tell us? When we leave one class in one room to determine our future, whether it's a political class, it looks after itself to the detriment of the rest. When you leave the business sector to think on itself, left alone, it looks after itself. Shareholdings and everything to the detriment of everything. But the moment we come together, given our capacity, we become a winning nation. The other day, we had a meeting with the ambassador of United Arab Emirates. They said they employ 170,000 South Africans. Met others from Canada, they said the same thing. He said, if you have a South African employee, whether black, white, Indian or colored, they have this resourcefulness that you won't find in any other person. They won't call you to say there's a problem. They say there was a problem, we came up with a plan. And yet, we look at ourselves and say, oh, South Africans are lazy. South Africans cannot do anything. And every country is dying to have us. Because this level of self-hate and self-doubt has become so ingrained in our collective psyche that we do not allow the power of imagination to go forward. Hence, then, I close with Frantz Fanon in The Wretched of the Earth, when he proclaimed that every generation must, out of relative obscurity, discover its mission, fulfill it, or betray it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof, for those framing remarks, and also just to sort of like give us a sense of direction, because we've been wrangling with this idea of where to from here or what to do with these scenarios. But I'm also very happy to announce that, you know, one of the most marginalized sectors in South Africa, which is the creative industries, by the mere fact that they're mentioned in these scenarios, they took an interest. And we had the National Arts Festival using the imagery of the Weaver Nation as part of their branding to celebrate 50 years of the National Arts Council, rather the National Arts Festival, pardon me. We also have a representative from the festival here, Rusero's here with us in the audience. And it was a difficult conversation we had to have with the artists, because as I was saying, it's the most marginalized sector. And they were saying, in this Weaver Nation of yours, here you have artists falling in and leading, you know, the uprising of the nation to challenge the status quo and to take us into the Weaver Nation. However, we are the most marginalized. And yet that sector was the first one to welcome these scenarios. And if you look at the branding for the festival, and they're going to be having a year-long campaign to celebrate 50 years of the National Arts Festival. So that is encouraging, because if we know that that's one of the key ingredients for the Weaver Nation, how do we then start with that campaign now so that we can mitigate against the vulture culture or the Hadida Nation, so that we can start actively and proactively working towards that Weaver work? Now, we've also mentioned that the president referenced these scenarios in his opening of Parliament. So we've invited the Speaker of Parliament, the brand new Speaker of Parliament, Osis Toko Didiza, to respond to these. And then after that, we're going to allow the audience and those who are on the Zoom platform to also have a moment to ask questions. But first, let us hear from the Speaker of the National Assembly. Sis Togo could not join us today. As many of you know, there's an Anisi Lekotla, but she was kind enough to send a recorded message, and I know she and her team have joined us virtually. But here is her message in her capacity as the Speaker of the National Assembly, which is one of the
Program
pillars
Director,
of our democracy.
Kolelwa Kashe Katia, Board of Trustees of the Indlulamithi SA Scenario, researchers and collaborators at Indlulamithi South Africa, ladies and gentlemen. It is my honor and privilege to address you on this important occasion of launching the Indlulamithi South Africa Scenarios that imagine various pathways to 2035. Allow me to applaud the leader in the group of thinkers, researchers, and modelers who have worked tirelessly in the background to produce the three scenarios, which are the Hadeda Home, Vulture Culture, and Weaver Work. Program Director, it would be amiss of me not to wish well the women of South Africa as we begin to honor and celebrate the Women's Month. Women have always worked like weavers, building homes, joining the resistance against oppressive laws in 1956, and nurturing new leaders to take this country forward. With the dawn of democracy, women have increasingly taken up the challenge of leading our public and private institutions, a story that must be celebrated unapologetically. The envisioned scenarios mirror the real risks and opportunities that could be realized based on the decisions we make today. They reflect the critical role of creating plausible legislation that is reflective of the will of the people. The 2035 scenarios incorporate new trends and experiences that influenced and shaped our country, our continent, and our world since 2018, when the last scenarios were published. Scenario planning enables leaders and decision makers to think through the thickness of the changing political landscape, emerging technological trends, and economic conditions. The three scenarios launched today will equip our lawmakers, executive and business communities to navigate a complex and ever-changing world that compounds our triple challenge of slow economic growth, inequality, and unemployment. These scenarios will enable us to future-proof our economy against unavoidable risks that could damage our democratic gains. Not only can they help us anticipate and prepare for future risks, but also empower us to capitalize on opportunities that lie ahead. What will South Africa look like in 2035? All of us can envision what we would like to see. In 2035, the Indlulamithi scenarios, however, depicts a South Africa where only 20% of the electorate that voted in 1994 will still be alive. The country's climate is much hotter. Pandemics have become more routine. The Eastern world powers are dominating the global economy, and technology innovations are what gives nations a competitive edge. These are crucial assumptions because they imagine the quality and type of international diplomacy and relations we must forge and the developmental areas we must invest in. The power of scenario planning lies in its ability to not produce an optimal future, but rather portray alternative futures. Truthfully, to the tradition of scenario planning, the team has given us three alternative pathways, which we must carefully consider and select the right one for South Africa. Without going into detail about each of the three scenarios, which Professor Somadoda Figeni has highlighted in his presentation, I would like to center my address on 2 points from the perspective of a legislature in our democratic system. First, it is important to appreciate that some of the trends and assumptions contemplated in the three scenarios, Vulture, Hadeda, and Weaver, have started materializing in our society. In the last 3 years, South Africans had attained lived experiences in the vulture world and had to deal with the mushrooming recriminate tentacles in some parts of our society. The COVID-19 lockdowns tilted our nation to desperate as well as we needed to balance the act of saving lives and keeping the economy afloat. The July 2021 unrest destabilized parts of our country, resulting in serious damage to infrastructure and vandalization of our trade corridors. Despite these events, South Africa stood firm and the rule of law prevailed, guided by our strong democratic institutions and planners like those at Indlulamithi, South Africa. What is important perhaps for today is to ensure that other driving forces of change identified in the Indlulamithi scenarios are incorporated in the efforts of implementing the Economic Recovery and Reconstruction Plan, a plan created to rebuild our country and revive the spirit of cooperation. From Parliament, we are ready to work with you in our oversight duties to ensure that your work is incorporated in government's programs. These programs must support the pathway that will bring us a cooperative nation, which was highlighted by President Ramaphosa in his opening of Parliament address 2 weeks ago. The second point I want to share is the obligation of researchers and generators of insights to empower our lawmakers such that these scenarios are reflected in the legislation developed in the country. The three scenarios are underpinned by common challenges of low economic growth, weakening state governance and democratically accountability, coupled with rising incidences of internal security threats. All these issues must inform the debates and dialogues at local, provincial, and national levels. They must translate into a functioning democracy underpinned by the rule of law and active citizens who uphold the principle of constitutionalism. The 2024-2035 scenarios come at an opportune time when important dialogues are taking place on the future of our country, and the need to address unemployment and poverty is more urgent than ever before. Grab this opportunity and sound the gospel of the cooperation nation that is envisaged in the Weaver Work scenario. By 2035, we certainly would like to see unemployment declining to 18% and youth unemployment dropping as well. That is a future we're prepared to work tirelessly for it to happen. As I conclude, I encourage you to translate these scenarios into languages and dialogues that can be accessed and comprehended by our diverse society. The insights and future pathways projected by these scenarios must empower our policymakers to produce legislation that will pave a better journey to 2035. I thank you.
Thank you so much for that response from Speaker of the National Assembly, Sis Togo. And what I appreciate is her reminding us that this is actually the first day of Women's Month in South Africa. And I think we need to acknowledge that, especially when we think about our keynote speaker. Now it's time for our question and answers, and I'm going to invite Naeem and Professor Fikeni to come to the front, and we will be taking questions from those who are with us in the room, but also we have someone monitoring the questions on the Zoom platform. Those who are joining us on the Zoom platform, please ensure that you use the Q&A function, not the chat function. That's where we're monitoring all your questions. So here we go. We hope that we don't have too many questions because the scenarios were so crystal clear, and we do trust that we frightened you enough to start thinking that maybe you need to figure out what to do with yourselves in the coming days and the coming years. I see there's 3-4 hands at the back, so that will be the first round of questions. And when you speak, if you can please introduce yourself and your affiliation. But also, I think we've picked up that there's someone who's on Zoom here in the room. So for those of us who are here in the auditorium, if you can please leave the Zoom platform because it's interfering with the sound. So we can start with the first question. You start by introducing yourself, where you're from, your affiliation, and so on, and then the question. And you can direct it to any of us here. And luckily, we have a board of trustees. I see even Bishop Mpumlwana has joined us now. They keep trickling in. So if we finding trouble responding, we'll also just get some of the board members to field some of the questions. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much for the presentation and the invitation. My name is Amanda Blankfield-Kossoff, and I'm running the Empowervate Trust, which is a youth development organization that works in schools across the country, promoting active citizenship, social cohesion, and nation building. So when I saw all of those words mentioned there in the Weaver section, I was very excited because that's exactly what we are doing. And this year we have 400 schools that are doing that across the country, in rural areas, in townships, and in urban areas. So my question is, how do we popularize and get support for that kind of work? Because that's what we need to get to the Weaver Nation. We can't just expect people at higher levels. We want grassroots people to actually start doing it. So, we need to have more kind of interactions. Like what we do is that we have the young people doing projects where they make a positive change to a social, environmental, educational, economic problem in their school or community. They actually have to do it themselves. And then they present what they've done and the impact that they made. So not just dialogues, like dialogues don't work for me. Like everyone can talk, anyone can say what they want. It's easy. But when it comes to action, how do we get people to do that? And what kind of reward or motivation do we provide to get them to actually get involved and get mobilized? And not just have that's the one scenario said that there's no creativity, there's no innovation. We have to change that around. And we have to say it starts with us. Can't wait. It's an urgent situation. We have to start now. Thank you.
Okay, my name is Maswile Ralebona from the SABC. My question is directed to Dr. Fikeni, Professor Fikeni. He said, should you take action? Should you take action? It means you must do something before it gets worse, based on some of the scenarios. So my question is, because what I know now, Parliament last year established a committee to work on the new Electoral Act or Electoral Amendment Act, hoping that by 2029 we will have a new electoral system. Is based on your assessment, do you think as South Africans voting for the president, like having a presidential elections, can be one of those actions that should be taken? Thank you. Is that going to make any difference given the chaos of the current system, which is the proportional representation, and what it has produced, which are the coalition government? You also said something about coalitions that are not regulated, of which I, for one, I thought after 2016, when the metros fell under coalitions, by now we will have something that is controlling some regulations, some legislation as to how to run the coalitions. And with the current GNU, nobody has spoken about regulations or legislation policy on those coalitions, which means going forward, it can be also chaotic. Should we change the electoral system to make as part of taking action before things get worse? Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Peter Lukey. I'm from the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment. And it's a question around the advocacy and the popularization of the scenario. I actually presented the scenarios to my colleagues about 3 or 4 weeks ago, and it ended up with massive conversations, huge debates, discussions. There was this overriding sort of feeling that perhaps the drivers, the variables were too pessimistic. I then received thank you. I then received a call yesterday from one of the people that were at that situation of saying, Peter, do you know that in terms of the scenarios, they were talking about the 1.5 degrees temperature being exceeded in 2034. Do you realize that, for example, that we've now globally gone through 13 weeks of global exceedance of 1.5 degrees, 13 months, sorry, 13 consecutive months. that the Sunday before last was the highest temperature in recorded history. That record held for one day because the second day, the Monday, broke it again. The Wednesday became the second highest and the third tied for the third place. So last week we had 4 of the hottest days ever recorded in history. And he sort of said, perhaps it wasn't that pessimistic. Perhaps, in fact, some of these drivers are overly optimistic. So the question is really, is there any attempt to actually put this kind of stuff into the easiest ways of communicating now is a YouTube video, a video of the scenarios so that people can access it easily. Because although many of us are trying to present the scenarios, we don't do it half as well as you do. Thank you.
Hi, I don't know, should I say good morning or good day? Good day, I think is a safer one. I've got a question. I think we all know, my name is Indlulamithi and I'm with the SABC News Research. I think we all know that in South Africa, the biggest threat to this democracy is social inequality. That's where all the havocs, they come from, the dissatisfaction, the complaining. As Professor Somadoda Figeni said, that we even find little things just to make noise about because sometimes we don't see the future. By and large, it's the social inequality. So in all the scenario planning, previously, many things have been tried. What else that could be tried to move or shift this dilemma of social inequality in this country and bring it to the positive stance, if any, that has not been tried, that should be tried? Because for me and all of us here, we know that that's the biggest threat. You go to Statistics South Africa, they give you that. To the academics, they give you that. The biggest threat is social inequality. Too many people have not even tasted the benefit of these 30 years of democracy. I think what else can be done? But I think that needs to be shifted. And Peter, thank you for suggestion of the video. You've just taken the point away from me. I had this point of saying, how about a documentary? It says YouTube. How about a documentary that can be made free for everyone to watch, to say, this is your country, this is where we're likely to go, what could be your role to play to shift this country to this direction, which is positive. Thank you.
Thank you for that first round of questions. I'm going to allow my colleagues to field, and if there's anything they want to throw my way, I will.
Thank you. To be very practical, people like Amanda and the work you're doing in the communities, I think should be celebrated and given more resources. One, I would like our team to get your contact so that we link you up into some of these programs. One of our Board of Trustees, Zugi, is also working with schools on imagining the 21st century and many other things, and would also appeal to businesses like Anglo to have a conversation with youth in particular who are doing a lot of work. Because remember, most of us who have clinged and dominated the space, we are not going to live into that future. We are somewhere in the boarding gates whilst you are still approaching the airport. So if I use that metaphor and so on, so we need to yield as much space as possible to that effect. So I would like us to be in touch and make sure that you are also involved in spaces such as national dialogue, because many people who are working on the ground who are not politically profiled, but who are simply doing the grassroots work. When we say there's a national dialogue, you suddenly find that people who have only skill of being profiled as political players are the ones who speak on behalf of everyone else. On the electoral system, I, as now a political science lecturer, we used to teach there are no less than 30 different types of electoral systems. But their performance, there is no magic wonder where you have a panacea Next door in Zimbabwe, they have a constituency system. Has it produced any magic? In the US, they have a presidential election. You vote for a president. They were only left with Trump and Biden. Just think of it. They had no other choice. One, they were worried he was going to fall on the steps walking up. The other one, they were worried about what next insult is going to explode from his lips. So that's the kind of a situation. What is important is to look at the entire ecosystem of empowering citizens, because it is from those citizens, it is from that family from which people who are ethical, who are visionary, are born. It's not the electoral system that will fix our problems. It is looking at the ecosystem that produces real leaders. What is the social history that produces a Mandela? What is the social history that produces a Martin Luther King Jr., a Winnie Madikizela Mandela, a Helen Joseph, and so forth? From schooling, religious institutions, family, media, everywhere else. Once you attend to that, you'll have an active, engaged citizenry and also a pool of harvesting the best cohorts of leaders moving into the future. Electoral system will simply enhance their capacity rather than becoming a silver bullet. But also, what is most important is that things such as coalition should be regulated. But we shouldn't wait for elections to be next month to talk about those. Talk about them when people are not so fearful, experiencing an existential crisis of losing elections tomorrow and so forth. And the other thing is simply reform the public service. Colette is here and she will know how important it is. We have underestimated the importance of professionalizing public service. The quality of life of any citizen on a daily basis depends on the quality of that frontline staff member in any department or a back office member, whether a teacher, a police, a nurse, a traffic officer, home affairs official, a soldier in the border. Those are public officials. They support judges, they support parliament, they support everybody. Even an investor coming to a country, if you have that professional public service that is ethical, that is people-centered and service-oriented, then you will not have many problems that we experience. But we've often focused on political leaders, political culture. You could bring the best political leader today if your public service is falling all over the place. They won't go far. Policies can't be implemented and so forth. But again, I've raised this one to the chagrin of political leaders. We need to professionalize political space, because you cannot have a situation like in KZN. They wrote to us in the PSC and other entities to say almost 17% of councillors would like to be taught on how to read and write. Now, those are people who oversee complex engineering, water engineering programs, civil engineering programs, and so forth. And they can tell which tender should go through, which one we're not going to approve the budget, and so forth. When in fact, they have no idea. When you are doing a PowerPoint presentation, it's just a hypnotic bioscope. And then the last one, the last one is, I think the issue of inequality is still a key driver indeed, but I'm sure my colleagues will speak into that. The form of popularizing this, if you come with any idea to us, whether you want to make a video game or a TikTok or a social media or a YouTube or even a life orientation class about this, we will be open to it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof, for that. And I'm glad that there's also potential sponsors here. What we're going to do now, we're going to tinker with the program once again because we're running behind schedule and we don't want to miss out on our keynote address. Ms. Nolita Fakude is giving us the keynote address. In the previous launches, we focused on the pillars of the state. As you've seen now, we've just had a response from the Speaker of National Assembly. But with these new scenarios, we want to focus beyond the state because even our research demonstrates that the state is not capable. So we've been bothering Anglo-American and others, Exaro, APSA, to say, you need to do something. So today I'd like to welcome Sis Nolita, who's a veteran as a captain of industry, has worked and led organizations such as SASOL, now leading Anglo-American, the chairperson of Anglo-American SA, but also the chairperson of the Minerals Council, formerly the Chamber of Mines. Sis Nolita, please come to the floor. And then we're going to continue with the Q&A after that keynote address. There's lots on the online platform. We've noted the questions there. We're going to deal with them after Sis Nolita's address. Thank you.
Thank you, Program Director, and good afternoon, good afternoon to everyone who's in the room as well as those who are online. Ms. Xolelwa, I'm pleased to tell you that as of 2 weeks ago, almost, I stepped down after 3 years of serving as the president of the Minerals Council of South Africa. I finished my term of office and my successor is Ms. Nombasa Tengwa, Dr. Nombasa Tengwa of Exaro. So we continue to work on the gender agenda and transformation, especially within our sector, which is mining. The board members and all protocols observed. Because of time, I'm not going to go through all those other processes. But suffice to say that I really want to, on behalf of business, to congratulate the Indlulamithi board and platform for successfully concluding the updated and revised scenarios for 2030 to 2035. Because by your foresight, you have been able to give us a much more reflective and up-to-date framework and common language that we can all use as citizens of the country to make sure that wherever we are as decision makers, we are making informed decisions based on the most relevant and credible data points. So that we don't get into a situation where one of the questions was coming through in terms of how do we make sure that everybody understands what is being said and implicated by the scenario. So thank you very much for the work that you do and continue to do, and congratulations for concluding that process. Earlier on, when we came through this morning into the room, one of my colleagues in the media space, Fariel Hafaji, and I were jokingly saying, there seems to be kind of an upbeat sentiment that is prevailing in the country. And to think that only about 60 days ago, about 2 months ago, we were all about to jump off the cliff for one reason or the other, because the noise and the narrative in the public sector about what was coming was almost like an Armageddon that we could not even imagine. And here we are sitting today and having yet another opportunity to reflect and, more importantly, to focus in terms of what it is that we need to do to intervene and course change and course correct where we need to as a country and also as citizens. And so with the changes that have come since the elections and the formation of the Government of National Unity, South African citizens are having more conversations and opinions about the future of the country, but hopefully with a different lens and probably with less of a sense of anxiety, but rather much more thoughtful and deliberate interventions and actions than we probably were having prior to the elections. Public sentiment matters, and we know that about that in business. We're often accused of talking about the market sentiment. And it's not only about the market sentiment that we all have to think about, it's the social sentiment, because that sentiment drives how people feel. And as a social scientist, personally, I do know that people's behaviors are influenced by what is happening around them, next door neighbor, what's happening at home, and also what is happening within your own community before you even get to the world of work or even into the broader society. So the sentiment does drive change. And as Prof. Figeni was saying earlier on, even listening to the news on radio, on TV, that shapes and influences sentiment. So we must not just think about sentiment from one perspective only and think about it only informing a particular sector of society, but rather being clear that by having all this noise into the system, we're actually influencing the mindset of everyone, including those who would like to feel more confident about us as a country, and therefore obviously invest in terms of what we believe is the possibility for this country. Having come out of a long period of negative public sentiment about the direction of the country, as I have said, it is important, therefore, that the trust that citizens have in our social and political institutions is nurtured, because it does foster social cohesion and influences how we all partner and collaborate to address our country's most urgent systemic challenges. It's almost near impossible to partner without trust, and much has been done in the past around really improving the trust, the so-called trust deficit, in particular between government and business. However, we do know that and acknowledge that much more still needs to be done to extend that trust building beyond just government to other members of society and community. And so as we do that, these scenarios that we see really encourage us and help focus the mind in terms of making sure that we are working on the right interventions and partnering accordingly. And so this is why, for example, Anglo-American has always been a supporter of the Indlulamithi Scenarios project since inception in 2018, because we want to be part of conversations that offer deep thoughtfulness and strategic action to take our country forward economically, socially, and politically. And the scenario planning framework does that so well. Scenarios are important since they help identify potential issues before they become real problems. Even though we do know that as from where we stand as a country, we already are in some of these scenarios for 2035, and therefore it is much more urgent than we make it to look like, because we do know that we could pick up some common threads and trends around the different scenarios that tell us that course correction is more urgent than most people believe. Like the Weaver scenario, we would like to see meaningful co-creation to deliver the South Africa we all want and deserve. Mindful that even as we are profoundly shaped by the world around us, our shared future is also an active choice. The question then is, how can we meaningfully influence that choice? How do we avoid a recrimination nation where infrastructure, social services, and the rule of law have been so eroded that we become a nation of rivalries and divisions? Or the vulture culture where we wage daily wars for resources and silence anyone who disagrees with the political elite? And I say, even with the economic mafias that are already starting to terrorize our communities as we speak. The cooperation nation is not ignorant of these risks and does not trivialize or glance over the immense work that must still take place. Instead, it bases change on an active citizenry, where all members of society play an integral part in shaping the future. Every citizen helps weave the future. Social capital, political will, and material resources all go a long way and can make a difference in terms of the sustainable outcomes. And so it should not be because one is bringing a particular capital into the conversation that we think that they have a much bigger voice than the other. All citizens and their contributions make a difference. One of the ways we as an organization and also as part of our corporate citizenship has been to form partnerships with other businesses through business associations like Business Unity South Africa, BUSA, Minerals Council of South Africa, Business Leadership South Africa, to name a few, to establish a platform called Before SA, or Business for South Africa, working with government to address our most urgent national challenges like GDP growth, investor confidence, and job creation to deliver inclusive growth. 12 months ago, when the Before SA platform partnership with government was established, there was a lot of criticism coming through from the media in terms of why were we propping up, quote unquote, the ANC government. That was a sentiment that was coming from the media. And had we not continued with that engagement, the results that I'm going to talk about in terms of what has been achieved by this partnership in the last 12 months would not have happened. And it's important, I'm mentioning this because it's important in the context of what was said earlier on, that every stakeholder should look at an opportunity and a positioning of how best can we be part of a much more broader collective engagement rather than bilateral conversations. But if you're only having one particular stakeholder still not even being willing to be part of the conversations, we should not be held at ransom to the lowest common denominator. Those of us who have the interests of the country at heart should engage and continue engaging, and hopefully when the results show themselves to be that it's positive, we can get more other people to come in and be part of the process. So by inadvertently modeling the Weaver scenario in our public and private partnerships 12 months ago, as I have said, Before SA has brought together over 130 CEOs from leading South African businesses to help the country realize its potential and remove bottlenecks to progress in 3 focal areas, namely energy, transport and logistics, as well as crime and corruption. And why these 3 priorities when we knew and we know that South Africa has got so many other priorities that we should be looking at? For us, it was important to focus on 2 issues. One, build the trust between business and government in terms of, yes, we could partner together in the interest of the country, not in the interest of any political party or any business in particular, but saying, what are the 3 things that every citizen is affected and impacted by? And you recall that 12 months ago, energy load shedding was an issue, whether you were private sector, public sector, or just an ordinary person, it was affecting you. Transport and logistics was another area that was affecting our economy and society, because if energy is the heartbeat of your economy, then logistics and transport infrastructure are the arteries of that economy. So if your economy is not able to take goods and goods from one area and deliver them to the customer where they are needed, whether that customer is local or international, then it means that you're not getting the revenues that you should be planning for. As an example, last year, because of the transport logistics challenges we had, and in particular within the mining industry, the government lost in revenues over 100 billion rands that they would have received in revenue, taxes, and royalties. And that 100 billion rands would have gone a long way towards supporting a lot of the social services and interventions that government needs as part of the fiscal bucket to deliver what is required for society. The third area of crime and corruption, for us, we said, if a citizen cannot feel confident that if they have had a misfortune of any sort happen to them, that they will not have any recourse, then that further erodes confidence for anyone. And therefore, the confidence building mechanism of making sure that crime and corruption was not only looked at with a lens of saying, let us fix the criminal and justice system to deliver for ordinary citizens before we could even talk about the broader corruption issues that affected our economy, we would not be where we are today. And so we do know that there are other possible priorities that we still continue to explore, which may include water, for example, because we know that is one of the crisis areas that's coming and that needs to be addressed in partnerships with different stakeholders. In the last 12 months, the partnership has achieved so much. For example, driving down load shedding levels by 61%, reducing anchor waiting times for container vessels at ports, especially Richards Bay Terminal, by 36%, and reducing criminal incidents on the Northern Corridor, which is the coal corridor for us, by 65%, has been some of the outcomes that we have seen. By definition, progress is always in motion. And before SA has set ambitious targets for 2025, like driving an end to load shedding, and through transport and industry, improve the performance of the public transportation system. Of course, this is just one example of how a public-private partnership worked out the right way can work. And the real cooperation comes when every part of civil society comes together to reframe our future. Labor, non-profit organizations, religious and faith leaders, and every individual citizen has a role to play, as I have said. No one doubts that an increasingly complex world with serious sustainability risks like climate change, food insecurity, energy and water constraints, and education inequalities, amongst others, need comprehensive and cohesive sets of structures to help it navigate the future. But when collective action is in the service of cooperation, it does create nuances rather than bureaucracy. It reinforces social connectedness rather than isolated individual issues. And we know that no one sector can do it alone. In closing, I'm reminded that South Africa has found itself closer to the 2030 Gwara scenario 6 years before the time. A nation torn between immobility and restlessness energy. However, with the sentiments being positive or at least neutral towards the government of national unity, it's time to use that restless energy and cautious optimism to advocate for change, drive social cohesion, and to deliberately and unashamedly insist on the South Africa we all need and deserve, every one of us working together. We need to ensure we have all hands on deck to steer clear of the Hadida home and vulture culture and weave a co-created society based on social cohesion, just like the weaver birds does. For the challenges faced by our country, we do need to make sure that we work together. We're not out of the woods yet, so we must continue to be vigilant and relentless in our pursuit for a better future outcomes. I thank you very much and all the best.
Thank you so much, Sis Nolita. It is so good to have strong Black women, steering these big ships, this massive ship called Anglo-American. And I hope that you will whisper to Dr. Nomba Satsengwade at the Minerals Council that we're coming to get the entire mining sector, because we do need the capital that resides within that sector to drive this movement. Now, I know that there's lunch that we're supposed to be breaking for now, but because we promised that we're going to allow for a proper engagement and a Q&A, we did not quite finish the last round. So I'd like Prof. Fikeni and again, Naeem to come to the front and just to respond to some of the first round of questions, around advocacy and the suggestions for using social media. Actually, it was Clem Santa himself, the godfather of scenarios, who actually said, this is what you must do. Film short clips using the birds. Already just today, using the bird sounds to animate, it has a lot of power in it, but short documentary clips with, the imagined future. And this is material that can be shared on social media platforms. We're definitely looking into that, but post-launch is part of our plan. We've already started with the translation of the summaries into about 8 different languages, I think. Yes, I did. I was reading the Xhosa version, which is actually quite good and interesting that now I can actually speak about the economy and all these complex things using Xhosa words, because we used to struggle before. We never translated. So when we had to go to Mhlobo Wenene, it would be a bit tricky. You would be talking about scenarios, variables. But at least now I've got a script, and there's a Tsonga one, there's an Afrikaans one. So we certainly are going to be doing that. And now just to recap on inequality, what I like is how Snolita actually got us to zoom into priorities to demonstrate how they were successful in business trying to support government in infrastructure, crime, and so on. And I think that's the key, is to actually minimize the number of priorities, because we have so many priorities as a country. We always have this endless list that are not achievable. You look at the NDP alone, there's so many priorities. So if we can narrow down, maybe focus on those 3 areas, or even use inequality, which was the one that was raised, as the key priority in all facets of our society, we just reduce inequality, and that's a priority. And I think we will find achievements there. Now I'm going to turn to the online platforms. We've received several questions there. It's quite active there on Zoom. And the first question is from Vusumuzi Mavuso, who wants to know about the advent of artificial intelligence and how it can bring about unprecedented phenomena in terms of fakes and so on. And I know we do talk about AI in our scenarios. As we finally Party is asking why we're not including the role of religion. But if Izaneli, we've asked you to download the book. You will look there in the Weaver Nation. There's a very huge role that faith-based organizations play there, working together with the artists, civil society, and so on, much like the 80s moment, because when we wrote that Weaver Work Nation, we're also looking at drawing parallels with the 1980s moment, where there was a mess movement where you saw the Bishop Tutus at the forefront there. It was like that purple line at the front of, that movement. So the Weaver Nation definitely has the faith-based movements as that. The third one from the online platform is we are making futures thinking a trend. We appreciate, I suppose that's a comment. And then others who preferred to be anonymous asked about the GNU and how is that going? Is there a likelihood that it could help us to achieve the South Africa that we require? I hope you're taking note of that, Prof. and Naeem. And then Umbusi Seyangobo is suggesting that employment equity regime be strengthened. And I think that's something that's also contained within those scenarios. Michael Folkster is talking about young women who are unable to find employment in South Africa, that they're actually thinking about exiting. And I think that's actually in the narratives as well. So I think I'll take a break here in terms of those online questions, and then we'll continue. But I think let's give the panel a moment to respond, and then we'll go back to the room.
So thanks, Kolelwa and Professor Fikeni, who answered most of or all of the earlier questions. And these questions, Kolelwa answered some of them. On the issue of AI, I'm not sure exactly what the person was asking, but certainly, as we say in the scenarios, all these technological advancements, and certainly AI is one of them, there's usefulness and benefits and also problems. So the questioner mentioned one or two problems, things like deep fakes, etc., but lots of others. I think for the creatives who are excited about our scenarios, this is certainly a challenge. I mean, you can literally now ask an AI to write a novel for you. I don't know how readable it would be and how enjoyable the story, but you can, and it will. And you can go on Amazon now and buy these such novels written by AI, and sometimes written by AI with the name of a real author attached to it. So the kind of opportunities for criminality will certainly increase with this, I think, in various kinds of ways. And so I think that what I'm trying to say is that we must have a sober approach to these technological advancements. I'm not a Luddite and I don't hate technology, but I think that a sober approach which realizes that there is good and there are challenges and problems with it. The early question about inequality and what can be done to shift this. Look, I'm not sure that any of us here can answer that question. It's a huge question. It's a question that government has been grappling with. It's a question that the medium-term development plan is grappling with for government of national unity for the next 5 years. It's a question that the NDP in 2012 grappled with and tried to propose ways in which it can be reduced substantially by 2030. And we haven't got much closer to those goals and targets. But you know, the NDP proposes that two kind of enabling ways in which you do that is one, economic growth, and the other, increasing employment. Again, on both of those measures, we haven't done much in the past just over a decade since 2012. As I said, our economic growth is less than 1%. Our unemployment is 40-something%. So we're not getting close to it. But reducing inequality and poverty, of course, as the NDP says, the two big goals of South Africa. If you want a kind of recipe of how it should be done, that's not going to come from here. We don't have magic bullets. But in terms of the scenarios, I think that we're suggesting that if society as a whole comes together in the manner that the Weaver work scenario talks about, that there's the possibility different sectors within society, including the state and business, etc., assisting and ensuring that there's assistance to each other, and that can help to reduce that inequality. But creating more employment is very much a part of that. Otherwise, it's not going to happen. Will the GNU help to achieve the South Africa we require? I think everyone in the union buildings is asking that question. Look, again, to use Professor Fikeni's phrase, there's no silver bullet. Number one. Number two, that I think it's very early to think about whether this GNU will even last for a 5-year period. We have a GNU statement of intent, which in the main sounds nice, sounds good, but so do all the parties' manifestos sound nice and good. Will this GNU manifesto now actually be implemented? Will it achieve all of the nice things that it says? We wait to see. But even as a government itself, will it last until 2026? That's a question. And beyond the 2026 elections, as it comes up to 2026, will the smaller parties in particular, that is not the largest party, but the others, feel that they would be better off contesting the municipal elections while not being part of the GNU? That's also a possibility. So I think that it's still early days. Let's, apart from the flamboyant statements by this or that minister claiming all kinds of great things, let's give it at least until the end of the year before we can talk about whether it's going to last beyond the year after.
Thank you so much for that, Naeem. We had some hands here that, okay, there's still a lot. Okay, I'll start here, 1, 2, and 3, 4. So it's Annette, Ricky, Toivo. Or we'll start with Toivo. And then we'll go back to the online platform. If they still want to ask questions, we'll have another round before we break for lunch.
Thank you. AI. I think the first thing to say is to congratulate you. I think this is great, and it's good for South Africa. There was a time when government used to do scenarios, time of pickers, and then we had organizations that also used to do scenarios, and society would debate the scenarios. So I'm very excited that you're taking us back to the world of scenarios. I think we should congratulate you for all the good work. Well done. My question is quite simple. What advice do you have for policymakers, implementers, decision makers? I mean, the planning and budgeting framework for government is quite, that template is quite complex. And I mean, we should welcome government's approach of moving towards an outcome-based approach. And I think that's what the scenarios get us to. They get us into a space of looking at outcomes rather than having many workshops. So what advice do you have for people like myself? I mean, I'm sitting next to Khomotso. She's building the Lanseria city, and she has to make sure that there's 3 million people that are living in the Lanseria city, and she must make sure that she attracts the necessary investments. But how does she take the scenarios and bring it into her space? And in my world, how do I use the scenarios to attract more investments into the country, for example, and knowing the planning system? What advice would you give us so that we can bring them to life? Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Trevor. My name is Komocho Letsatsi. I'm with the Gauteng Growth and Development Agency, heading up the Lanseria Smart City, as Trevor has said. And also congratulations on the hard work. It was quite informative. I just have a few comments and maybe questions just in between. Just on the scenario planning and based on the stakeholder engagements that you would have taken in the past 8 years, how do you envisage the private sector and the public sector working towards common socioeconomic indicators to avoid some of those scenarios such that the interventions are basically impactful. Because one of the major issues that I think government has struggled with is the silo approach in terms of planning and basically implementation, especially within the government. And also, I was saying to Toy, it feels like we're in 2035 already. If you look at the youth unemployment, and it's quite scary that we have scenarios where youth unemployment is growing to 63%. But already, if you look at what's happening in societies, in townships, the issues around drugs and the impact that is basically having on family units and the elderly as well, it's almost like we are headed for a whole generational gap in terms of that and where it puts us as a country, and how do we just avoid that? Because with what's happening currently, that scenario might actually be worse than even the 63%. And then on the governance, I think the issue around the coalition that started in 2016, and if you like, it started with the metros. And the metros actually dominate the economic basket in South Africa. So it was a leading indicator pretty much where the country was going. And if you look at where the metros are in terms of just their audit outcomes, they all moving towards junk status with the exception of Cape Town, and just how the coalition government basically even failed governance in those metros. Some of us are actually quite pessimistic towards the GNU because the opposition basically did not assist in that particular regard. And how do you see that basically impacting the scenarios that you've basically outlined? And then, of course, lastly, which is actually more worrying, which is the collateralized borrowing that has been anticipated because of the weakening of state finances and basically balance sheet, where we might end up even having to sell our crown jewels for consumption expenditure in terms of paying salaries, because we haven't really invested in economic infrastructure, and our capital formation trajectory has actually been quite disappointing. How do you see government basically responding to that, even from a policy point of view? And I think it builds pretty much to the budgeting process that has played itself out in the past 30 years that actually Toivo basically touched on. But congratulations on the hard work and the good work. Thank you.
Two hands this side.
Thank you. Yeah, let me try and find my words. So I think beyond finding ways to help people understand the scenarios, as the previous questions have demonstrated, we also need to talk to how to work with the scenarios. I don't think it's just about, oh, what's in the future and imagining the future, but it is really more about how do we work our way towards the most positive scenario and avoid the more negative scenarios. And in this sense, I think that the Indlulamithi scenarios work with the barometer is amazing work. And more needs to be taught about that. But in a sense, you need more barometers. When I hear the discussion and the discourse that we've had today, it's been a discussion and a discourse aimed significantly at the state and at business. But when we look at the barometer, does the barometer talk to business? And if we're talking about a social compact, that's more than the state and business. So then we're talking about civil society and we're talking about all these other groups. I think that in order to achieve the optimal scenario of the Weaver community, we do need a social compact. And if we're going to have a social compact, there has to be a level playing field in a sense. And so we don't focus our indicators. I mean, what was lovely about Sis Nolita's contribution is they have indicators, so they are very clear about the progress they're making. And that's what the barometer does, right? It begins to talk to what are the indicators that tell us if we're moving in the right direction or in the wrong direction. So one of the contributions I want to make is that that barometer must be able to talk to each and every member of a social compact and not just to the state or not broadly. And then the third element is the third pillar, essentially, of Indlulamithi scenario work, which is the dialoguing processes, right? And in the dialoguing processes, again, at that pillar, there's the problem of power. And that's what I saw again in the room today. We talk to government, we hear from and ask money of the corporate sector. And that's because there's a power dynamic. But if we're saying we as a society are going to have to make some hard decisions and each and every one of us contribute, when we're having dialogues, then we have to manage the power in the room. And we don't do so like by speaking. We have to manage the power in the room so that the real new ideas can emerge. So I think that when we're talking about how do we share this, it has to be across the pillars of the work that is being done, and on top of it, deeper into each of those pieces of work. How do we make sure, in a sense, that we're giving people the tools for accountability, so that it's not, oh no, we're here, we're at the table, we're in the dialogue. Oh no, we're here, we're at the table, we're funding this and this aspect. But then we're not really focusing on how the corporate or the business sector is pulling us away from scenarios. So that was the one point that I think is worth thinking about. And then the second point that I think is important and we will need to pay more and more attention to is the global and continental context. In as much as it's a hot potato or can be difficult, I don't think that it's achievable for South Africa without the rest of the continent. And we're going to have to pay much more attention to that over time. But thank you. It's been a really interesting process, being involved in the reference group, being involved in contributing to the scenarios development, and the outcome is a great reflection of the work that we've done over the years.
I think Annette,
Thank you very much. And I want to add my words of congratulation. Some of what I was planning to say has partly been covered, but let me just, by way of emphasis, because, you know, I think the big question is, so what? What now? You know, I mean, that's what everyone is really saying. This is fantastic work. In implementation science, we talk about creating new knowledge, and new knowledge has been created. The question is, how do you translate that knowledge into material practice? In other words, how does this wonderful research and knowledge and engagement and, you know, how does that then change the material conditions on the ground in South Africa for ordinary people? You know, I think that's really what the big question is, and there's been a lot said about, you know, the methodology of that, dialogues, social compacts, and so on. But, you know, and how do we achieve those outcomes? And, you know, I'm speaking as an independent person right now. I have left government. That's another story. So, but I think the issue is also that there is a need for accountability, even of government, because as Naeem said, we did look at the scenarios and in developing the medium-term plan, you know, which will be for the 24 to 2029 period. And we've also, there were exercises of all planning officials across the whole of national government and provincial, you know, representatives. That's like hundreds of planning officials. They participated in the exercise because we wanted them to actually start thinking. We don't just have templates. Templates are actually very destructive in many instances. If we could just abolish the templates, because planning is an analytical a creative process. So we wanted that to be entrenched. However, so we need to change the methodology of government planning, and I'm glad that the Parliament, the Speaker was here, because we want those portfolio committees. When government comes and says, this is our APP or whatever, our strategic plan, we want those portfolio committees to be able to say, but how are you addressing the issue raised in Indlulamithi scenarios with regard to the increasing power of organized crime, for example, So if we're talking about creating awareness, but that's great, but we want to see it translated into plans across national, provincial, and government and local government. Maybe we should take this to Salga. Indlulamithi should also take it to Salga to say, what does this mean for you? What can local government do differently in order to, again, as the other speaker said, optimize the future outcomes, And then, of course, civil society. When we talk about, we're talking about all sectors. Yes, business has a critical role to play, and it's great. We heard what a difference that business can make. What are trade unions doing? What are women's organizations doing, if they still exist? Youth, civics, etc. Indlulamithi could play a role. The barometer is great. It measures outcomes. I think many of us are never surprised with the outcomes because we get the quarterly labor force survey, unemployment, we get the GDP, the where we are on outcomes indicators is often clear. But the issue is, what are the priority actions and interventions that are needed to shift the needle on the outcome? And maybe Indlulamithi Trust could play a role in also, at least getting the different entities, to say, this is how we have interpreted the scenarios, and this is what we are going to do differently. Sorry to go on for a long time. Thank you. But thank you very much.
I think I'm just going to cut it here in terms of these so that respondents are able to manage the questions. But I've taken note of that for the final round of these two hands. So that will be the only three hands, and that's it. But I've noted some from the online platform. So maybe I would give the ones on the public service space, that's your area, in terms of how you would advise policymakers. And Naeem, there's some constitutional questions on the online platform. Maybe I'll pose those to you. But just in terms of how to use the scenarios, I think we were very reluctant when we started to find our space and our role in society. We regarded ourselves as just researchers who did this wonderful work, and then we would then disseminate it across society. We went on roadshows, covered the whole country. But what we also found utility in was a process called wind tunneling or stress proofing strategies. So we would get invited to strategic planning sessions, whether it's a community. I think we had a community, a very impoverished community in Ekabeja that was struggling with criminality and gangsterism, but that community could use the scenarios to wind tunnel their strategy. So the idea is to take your strategy, to test proof it. If you've got plans, any organization, whether you're in private sector, civil society, or you're starting a crash, there would be some kind of strategy. But for that plan, it's to test it against these three scenarios to understand whether your strategy would survive any of the eventuality. Say, if we end up in the vulture culture, how does your organization mitigate for that? If we're in Hadida, or how does it prepare itself or contribute towards the building of a Weaver nation? So in a way, you've got a strategy that can withstand any of the eventualities. So if we were to all do that in our corners, that was the past, but now we're going into strategy where we're seriously considering the swear words that we've been wrangling with as Indlulamithi, lobbying, because now others are saying, why don't you do this work? Why don't you go out there? You've got sufficient legitimacy. You can bring business. You can bring, we're engaging with Kakiso Trust, but we've been reluctant because we don't want to be regarded as lobbyists or what do we settle on? advocacy. I think that's what we're going to be doing going forward. And facilitation, because we have the convening power. So if we can galvanize society, then maybe we can bring labor, we can bring civil society, because there is a trust deficiency that exists amongst these. So we're going to be going on our strategic planning session. We're hoping on Saturday, straight after this session, after getting all this wisdom from you all, but I think we'll be very exhausted. So in a week or so, we'll be going strategy, where we're going to be planning for that advocacy work. So I think I'll hand over to Prof around to the public service and how.
I guess the starting point should be to say every issue you are raising and questions being raised and suggestions, we're taking them very seriously. We don't have all the answers. The operative word is co-creation. Wherever you are, no input is less important. We've come this far 8 years later, not because we had a copyright of wisdom, but because we had embraced sincerely the principle of co-creation to say, let's come and create this together, because from each side, you will provide rich insights that we may not have. So that's the starting point. We will collate most of these. Sometimes you may walk away feeling my specific answer was not answered. We will transcribe, we will listen, we will come back, we will invite you into further engagement. So that's the starting point. The second one is we should not have, even at the hardest of times, the notion of this South African exceptionalism at times when things hit us so hard. We forget that South Africa is like any other country. We should learn from those countries. We should see what is happening and so forth. Some of the bad things, some of the good things and so on, because at the hardest of times, we tend to just indulge in what is happening inside ourselves and not even gaze and look around what is happening. But what we look around and realize that the whole world, each region is experiencing some serious challenges. So even for business, it's no longer easy to say, I'm going to leave you, I'm going to the Middle East. Say, Middle East where? I'm going to Europe. They say, do you think these wars are going to end anytime soon? So it then says, stand where you are. If your lawn is turning brown, water it until it is green. That is the key thing. Because there is nowhere to run to. Even regions which are not having geopolitical problems, they have climate change, wildfires. So we are in an equal opportunity moment of vulnerability as the world. So it is very important, this threat of saying, I'm going to leave you. Everywhere there is fire. Just make sure where you are, you make things work. Now, on the public sector side, I think one of the biggest problems that we suffer from as a country, it's two things. Maybe three. The first one is common sense deficit, an acute one. We have complicated everything. That's why you get a message which says save energy, and then you go to all the townships, you find public lights are on. They say save water, you see water flowing, clean water. It's because complexity, regulation, bureaucracy has become an industry in itself. Hence, we obsess on compliance, conformance, and malicious compliance to a point where it takes more time just doing compliance before you do anything. When I wanted to just destroy a small shed outside my house. It took me a year. Writing to municipality, I had to pay 25,000 rands because compliance this, compliance that. Now the previous owner, the distance from the wall and so forth. To build that house outside, it took me 1.5 months. It's because we have become drunk with regulation, with compliance, with complications and so forth. When I was in Canada, I knew what my tax returns were. When I'm here, I can't do it because somebody has to do it. It's too complicated. And the book there is almost 800 pages. We've become more, even here around Sentin, you'll see the biggest and the tallest buildings are the audit firms, the law firms, because they are compliance, they are regulation, they are everything else except the core. Maybe we just need to simplify our society. That's the first thing. Then the red tape will go away. Now, on the issues of what is to be done at a practical level, I think as the national dialogue comes, we just have to congregate or consult each other on how we make input from your vantage points and what can possibly be done to translate these ideas into practical interventions, not only to government, but private sector and so forth. But as Nolita was saying, from where we were, private sector and government, the mutual suspicion was great. But since, I guess, COVID, the partnership, the working together has been coming and coming. And remember, we're in new spaces, whether it's GNU or it's business, government partnership, private sector partnership, where the person you have always accused to be a witch who is poisoning your food, now you must learn to stay with that person and enjoy lunch and breakfast together. It's a new reality. But at the same time, we must just change those, dynamics. Again, I come back to the issue of the public sector reforms. Very important. We've always created it to be number last. The National Development Plan puts it at chapter 13. And yet somewhere you read, it says everything we're promising in this National Development Plan will depend on a capable, ethical, developmental state. Whether you're starting a smart city, or you're starting an investment, or you're doing planning, if you have not fixed the issue of state capacity, and also you have not been honest about the fact that inequality is the biggest key driver that is causing dissensus in our society, and try to simplify those things. It's a broad way of answering the many questions that came, but I think by saying, let's just co-create, and your ideas will be taken to heart. Thank you.
Thank you for all the questions and very useful comments. I want to say that some of the kind of depth of the questions in terms of government practice, implementation, etc. I think that those require separate sessions. There's only so far that scenarios can go in trying to address that in a general kind of way. So, for example, when Annette spoke about the numerous workshops held with planners at from different spheres of government, those were very detailed, and each of those workshops were like 2 hours, sometimes longer, that looked at these things for specific things. And what do these scenarios mean for this particular kind of challenge, etc. So I think that's important to consider, that we can't give kind of broad responses to very specific questions. But that also brings me to another point, and this is also responding to one of the online comments, TK Pue. So he asks, he says, the idealized scenario clamors for a liberal constitution and a liberal constitutional democratic order. Firstly, we don't believe that we have an idealized scenario. The Weaver work is not an idealized scenario. If we wanted an idealized scenario, we'll have a wish list that says that in 2035 we have 0% unemployment. These scenarios are not meant to be wish lists. They're not meant to be what we aspire to have, because then our aspirations are very low. Even the Weaver work one, that's very low. To be happy with 18% unemployment, like, what's wrong with us, right? So these are not ideal scenarios. These are projections from where we are today, and that's why it's years of research. I mean, one of the partners was DPME, as I said. One of the other partners in this was HSRC, from whom we got a wealth of research and seminars and roundtables, etc., before we put that down on paper to say, okay, this is the possible trajectory, right? So what the scenarios are possible trajectories for 2035 if certain policy choices are made. If no policy choices are made. If certain choices are made, we'll go in this direction. If other choices are made, we'd go in that direction. And of course, government now, and so if the cabinet Lokhotla is talking about these scenarios, they will look at policy choices taking from different scenarios and putting that together. So clearly, the fact that the president spoke about this in his speech means that he would really like to arrive at the Weaver work conclusion, but without going through the painful mid-2020s. He doesn't want to see an uprising taking place. He wants to short circuit that and try and get to the 2029 thing that we talk about now in 2025. Okay, so it's policy choices that are made. So no, TK, we're not idealizing anything. We're not saying that it should be a liberal constitutional order or any such thing. We're saying that from where we are today, these are three possibilities of where we could end up in 2035. It's not prescriptive, but policymakers have to look at these trajectories and say, okay, how do we use this in order to achieve your best case scenario or something better than that even. Kanya, nice to hear from you. Kanya and I know each other. The public perceptions of the constitution, did they influence the scenarios? Look, I think that the broad public, we have 60 million people in this country, the broad public knows the constitution by how they experience it, not because they read it. Their perceptions of the constitution are service delivery, how democracy works for them. So that experience of the constitution is what fed into our process of developing the scenarios. We don't know whether people understand the clauses of the constitution. That didn't feature in our discussions. I mean, I don't think that's what you're asking, but I'm just saying that it's people, when people say that they don't have water and they don't have electricity, they don't say when you on the street, they don't say the constitution says X, Y, and Z about our right to water. They say we need service delivery. We don't have water. Our life is at stake. Our livelihoods are at stake, and those concerns fed into these discussions. So in many of the preparatory processes, we engaged with social movements. We engaged with organizations of disabled people, etc. And the experience of what the constitution means for them in reality is what fed into it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We've lost several people on the Zoom platform because we've gone over time. I think it's close to an hour. I know I promised 2 people to just quickly, because now we're supposed to have finished at about 20 past 12. It's now after 1. Quick one, quickly.
Quick one. from my side. My name is William Matamela. I just wanted to find out, there's currently a huge vibe in the country with regards to AGOA. And I was a bit intrigued by your findings that said that people fund it, or the people have expressed finding it very restrictive. And I just wanted to find out, and I know you did mention earlier on that you don't have answers for everything, but if you are aware, has the restrictive nature of AGOA been told to you guys? Are you aware of it? And that has caused so much unhappiness, and how can we best broaden it? Thank you.
Okay, and there was one here.
This one here with the mic.
Okay,
That's
and
it,
then
please.
please, then we're done. Yes.
Okay, thank you. My name is Herman Badali. Should I continue?
Continue, yes.
Okay, my name is Herman Badali. I'm a member of Progressive Professionals Forum in Gauteng. I will just I'm hungry, so I'll summarize my questions because I want to go in. My 2 or 3 questions is that, and we welcome the research work that you've done. Well done, guys. Once again, for me, it's more solution orientated. What kind of South Africans do we need to achieve the Weaver scenario? And you can categorize them from especially for me, is the education system. What type of education system should it produce an outcome that will propel us going to the Weaver scenario? You've talked about the public servant, what type of public servant we need, and. But more importantly, what type of value systems do we need as a country to propel us more closer to the Weaver system, the scenario? And the second one is on yourself, on the work that you're doing. That would it be possible for you to monitor these scenarios and give public quarterly reports to say, Q1, this is where we are, Q2, so that there are alarm bells if we're reaching the vulture system earlier than to say we are 95% to reach, or we are 80% reaching the vulture, whatever it may be. Can you create that system? And let me limit
Okay,
myself.
last question.
Thank you.
Very last one of the day. Thank you very much.
Hi, Prof. Golelwa, the board. This was an excellent work. I must say that, Priscilla from Anglo-American, by the way, this is going to be a missed opportunity for such an amazing research not to lead into action, all right? I think we all have said that we want to be in the Weaver phase, 2035, if not sooner. What I'm wondering though is the new cabinet ministers, all of them in the GNU, have they been socialized to actually understand what the scenario means? And if not, I think while you gather together, readdressing the key focus area of Indlulamithi in one of your Saturdays, perhaps it will help, to unpack what the end goal or success factors will entail from the advocacy point of view. I think the second one is that President Ramaphosa spoke about the national dialogue. And hopefully this will be very soon. We don't know when is it going to happen. But however, we all know that in South Africa, the president has his own vision and the ministers does the opposite, all right? And then implementation lacks from across the various ministries. This scenario is actually an eye-opener for us, for South Africa, to say that should all these ministries not do something about it, we are going to, prolong the Hadida and the vulture phases in a very long time. So it would be great, if these scenarios can be supported across the various ministries and followed by the key actions, responsibilities, and some form of accountability, so that each and every minister, as the president speaks about the national dialogue, he understands the weaver. But what does it mean for the other ministries, and what accountability is going to look like? And, I think in the next 5 years, this is what the government or the GNU must come back to South Africa and say, we are taking you out of the hadidas and the vultures. This is where we're going. And it has to be clear. When they have all this lekgotlas, nation address, budget speech vote, whatever you name those terminologies, at least they must be associated with the actions that is coming from this research, because it's talking about the facts. It's factual in terms of where we are in South Africa. And my last
Please
question
make it your last
is,
word, please.
No, not question. After the scenarios, I want to know what's next for Indlulamithi.
Thank you very much for that. And I think I'll just quickly summarize quick responses. I know you're concerned about the AGOA. I mean, what we think we must always remind ourselves, these are not predictions. We are in no ways claiming to be seers that can see the future. We work with a particular methodology and various permutation, and we say these are likelihoods. So what you read there is not something that's cast in stone, that this is exactly how it would happen. So that's how you should receive it, that these are likelihoods, it can go anyway. And also going into the next question around the measuring, we do have a barometer, the Prof mentioned it. We've been running it since 2029. So for the old scenarios, every year we would release data in terms of where we are. And that's how we concluded that we were in the Kwara, which was the state of lawlessness. So as of now, we're going to design using indicators, and next year we're going to reveal where we are now in terms of these new scenarios. So it's difficult for us to speculate that, oh, now we're in Hadida, or it's looking like that in terms of AGOA, because we have not done the measurement of the barometer. So once that happens, in terms of what kind of South Africa and what kind of vision, it will take that national dialogue to establish that, because we cannot prescribe that. Because as things stand, South Africa is so diverse. We've got so many diverse interests that are sometimes at odds with one another. So that's why we're always butting heads. So for us to find that North Star that guides us towards that South Africa we aspire to, then the national dialogue could be a valuable platform for that. In terms of what government is doing, I mean, we've been engaging with government since we started in 2018, but Annette sitting behind you, has been working with the Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation. They're trying to infuse the scenarios in government planning at all levels. We've engaged not just with ministers, but with all the different department planners, but also going down to provincial and even municipal level, so that there's that thinking, they're always aware of it. And then that's when the wind tunneling idea comes in. I know Prof wanted to say one thing. I'm gonna stand here, I won't move, because I want him to be aware that he cannot give another address. So Prof, I know you indicated to me before we close.
I think I'll just microwave it by saying, we are not only part of Indlulamithi. For example, I chair the Public Service Commission, and we've been tasked with the implementation of it. Hence, we bring in scenarios to say infuse it. As you heard, Abba, who is part of this exercise, and other members from Mapungu are in the leadership conference to also spread the pollen. And I'm part of the forum of Chapter 9, Chapter 10 institutions, those constitutional bodies, where we're saying, what should be our role to make this thing work? And next week, I'm launching the forum of the SADC Public Service Associations, because we're part of this broader ecosystem of the region. So we would like you in your spaces, for example, Nolita being in these business forums, to spread the pollen, then you'll see the difference. Even on the issue of the borrowing and the rising, debt, we are beginning to revisit to say what are the inefficiencies of the state. For example, a very specific practical thing. As the PSC, we discovered that government doesn't know how many people who have been at home being paid with full salary. One worst case was 12 years, others 8 years, 7 years. That's money. Others like Transnet, you remember, or was it PRASA, the ghost employees, 2,000. Those are the monies that form up this 2 billion that is borrowed every day, and the 1.2 billion that is paid to the debtors or the creditors. So the efficiency of the state, the growing of the economy, and the improvement of the state capacity to do its work will go a long way. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. And with that said, would like to bring this to a close. But before I do that, I'd like to thank you all for attending. And I'd like to also thank those who joined us on Zoom for their patience. For those who are still around with us, we know it took long. We delayed the start. We'd like to thank the media fraternity that joined us today. Our board of trustees, they were here, Nompumelelo Runji, Bishop Mpumlwana was here, Kes Kuvedia, Michelle Constant, who are led by Professor Somadoda Fikeni, members of our EXCO who are also here, who made everything happen. These are the people who are behind the scenes, mostly not even in the room, but I'd like to acknowledge our executive committee members, and others are busy presenting at the Likotlas and so on. The reference group members, I've seen several of them. I see people those we've engaged with, we had lengthy interviews, 2-hour-long interviews, and they gave us all these insights, based on their knowledge of their sectors. Thank you very much for, your insights and how those insights influenced this process. Our research team, starting with Heidi Brooks, Dr. Heidi Brooks from the School of Governance. She started this research process when she was still working at MISTRA, working with MISTRA researchers. Some of them are here with us, HSRC, DPME, our partner in research, the writing team with Professor Harry Dugmore, who's joined us from Australia. I hope he's still online. Harry, thank you so much for your leadership there. Fred Kumalo, the lead writer, for his creative input, because we're also trying to make the storylines also interesting to read and not as dense, because we're not trying to produce an academic product here. So thanks, Fred Kumalo. Naeem Jenna, once again, who's read over the book over and over again. All our sponsors and partners, Anglo-American, that have given us this room free of charge, and even the catering, all the streaming services. We'd like to also thank APSA, another sponsor. We'd like to recognize Exaro, founding sponsor. We also like to recognize Nedbank, potential sponsor, Content, Remgro, other partners such as Sibanye, Merupa, first PR agency, our current PR agency. Funi is not in the room, but she's the one who made this whole event happen. Mediclinic, Mapungupa Institute for Strategic Reflection, our very strategic partner, who are even hosting us because we don't even have an office, so we're starting there at MISTRA, and many others that I have not mentioned. But thank you very much. And we do look forward to further engagements in that national dialogue. We look forward to you inviting us for those wind tunneling sessions and for you to spread the message. And when we call on you again, we hope that you will join us. Thank you, and please join us for lunch.
Okay. Yes.